Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets.
The snow fell softly over West Valley City, Utah, on that chilly December evening in 2009, blanketing the quiet streets in a hush that felt almost sacred. In a modest two-story home on a cul-de-sac, Susan Powell stood at her kitchen counter, her hands dusted with flour as she rolled out dough for a batch of Christmas cookies. The radio hummed a faint carol. Silent Night, perhaps, its melody weaving through the air as her two little boys, Charlie and Braden, giggled in the living room. At 28, Susan was the picture of warmth. Chestnut hair pulled into a loose ponytail, a smile that lit up her green eyes, and a laugh that friends said could melt the coldest day. To anyone passing by, peering through the frosted window at the glow of her home, this was a scene of suburban bliss. A young Mormon family preparing for the holidays, bound by faith and love. But perfection is a fragile thing. Behind that window, beneath the surface of Susan's life, something darker simmered. Something that didn't fit the neatly framed photos on the mantel or the cheerful chatter she shared with neighbors over the fence. It lived in the silences, in the glances she cast toward her husband, Josh, when she thought no one was watching. It lingered in the way her shoulders tensed when his voice sharpened, or how her laughter faded when he walked into the room. This was Susan Powell's world on December 6, 2009. The last day anyone would see her alive. And though no one knew it yet, the facade she'd built so carefully was about to crack wide open. Susan had always been a dreamer. Born Susan Cox on October 16, 1981 in Puyallup, Washington, she grew up in a tight-knit family, the second of four sisters. Her parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, raised their girls with the values of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints: faith, family, and hard work. Susan was the spark of the bunch, creative, kind, and endlessly optimistic. As a teenager, she filled notebooks with sketches of wedding dresses and wrote love poems she'd blush to share. She wanted a fairy tale, a husband who'd cherish her, children to dote on, a home filled with joy. And when she met Joshua Powell at a church event in 2000, she thought she'd found it. Josh was 24 then, 3 years older than Susan, with a lanky frame, dark hair, and a quiet intensity that drew her in. He wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't need to be. He had a way of looking at her, steady and unblinking, that made her feel seen. They bonded over their shared faith, their talks stretching late into the night about God, marriage, and the future. To Susan, Josh was a puzzle she wanted to solve. A man who seemed reserved but promised devotion. Her family wasn't so sure. Chuck Cox later said Josh struck him as too serious, too possessive, even in those early days. But Susan was in love, and in April 2001, less than a year after they met, she walked down the aisle in a white gown of her own design, her heart full of hope. The first years weren't all bad. They settled in Utah, a hub for Mormon families, and welcomed their sons, Charlie in 2005 and Braden in 2007. Susan threw herself into motherhood with the same zeal she brought to everything else. She sang lullabies in a voice so sweet it hushed the boys to sleep, crafted scrapbooks of their milestones, and taught them to pray with tiny hands clasped tight. At church, she was a fixture, organizing potlucks, volunteering for nursery duty, her energy a beacon to those around her. Friends like Kiersey Helluel adored her. Susan was sunshine, Kiersey would later say. She made you feel like the only person in the room. But sunshine casts shadows, and Josh was hers. On the surface, he played the part of the dutiful husband, working odd jobs in IT, tinkering with cars in the garage, nodding along at Sunday services. Yet there was a coldness to him, a detachment that unsettled those who looked closer. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it didn't reach his eyes. Susan's friends noticed how he hovered, always nearby, always listening, as if guarding her every word. At home, he controlled the finances with an iron grip, demanding receipts for every grocery trip, every diaper pack. "It's our money," Susan would argue, her voice trembling. No, Josh would snap back. It's mine to manage. The fights grew louder over time, spilling out from behind closed doors. Neighbors heard them, sharp exchanges about money, about Susan's job at Wells Fargo where she thrived as a stockbroker, about how she spent too much time with friends. Josh didn't like her independence. He didn't like her light. Once, at a ward picnic, he pulled her aside after she'd laughed too long with a male friend, his hand tight on her arm. "You're mine," he hissed, low enough that only she heard. Susan brushed it off with a nervous smile, but the mark lingered, both on her skin and in her mind. By 2009, the cracks were impossible to hide. Susan confided in Kiersey about the weight she carried. Josh had grown erratic, obsessed with conspiracy theories, paranoid about the government, and resentful of her success. He'd quit his latest job, leaving her to shoulder the bills, yet still dictated how every dollar was spent. Worse, he'd begun to withdraw entirely, locking himself in the basement with his computer for hours, emerging only to criticize her cooking or the boys' noise. "I don't know who he is anymore," Susan whispered to Kiersey one night, tears streaking her face. "I don't know if he even loves me." She tried to fix it. That's who Susan was, a fixer, a believer in second chances. She suggested counseling, but Josh refused. She pushed for date nights, hoping to rekindle what they'd lost, but he'd sit across from her at dinner, silent and sullen. She prayed harder, clinging to her faith that God could mend what was broken. And in her quiet moments she wrote, pouring her fears into a spiral notebook she kept hidden in a drawer. "I want to leave," she scribbled in one entry, the ink smudged with doubt. "But the boys, I can't take them from their father. What if he hurts me? What if he hurts them?" That fear wasn't baseless. Susan had seen flashes of something darker in Josh, moments when his temper flared beyond words. Once, he'd thrown a chair across the room during an argument, the crash echoing as Charlie wailed upstairs. Another time, he'd grabbed her wrist so hard it bruised, his eyes wild with something she couldn't name. She told her sister Denise about it, her voice shaking over the phone. "He's not the man I married," she said. "I'm scared, Dee. I'm really scared." Yet to the outside world, they were still the Powells. Susan with her bright smile, Josh with his stoic presence, the boys with their matching Sunday suits. On December 6, 2009, that facade held firm. Susan spent the day like any other. Church in the morning, a nap with the boys in the afternoon, and then into the kitchen to cook. A friend, Giovanna Owens, stopped by with her daughter to drop off a crochet project. Susan was her usual self, chatty, warm, offering them snacks as the boys played nearby. Josh was there too, quieter than usual, hovering in the background. Giovanna left around 5 p.m., the last outsider to see Susan alive. She seemed fine, Giovanna would later say. Happy even. I never thought. The night deepened. The snow thickened outside, blanketing the house in stillness. Inside, Susan tucked Charlie and Braden into bed, kissing their foreheads, whispering prayers over their dreams. Josh stayed downstairs, his silhouette framed by the flicker of the TV. What happened next, no one can say for sure. The walls of that house held their secrets tight. Secrets that would unravel in the days to come. Secrets that would leave Susan's name etched in a mystery no one could solve. By morning, she was gone. The kitchen sat untouched, the dough still on the counter, hardened into a silent witness. The boys were missing too, and Josh would soon return with a story so strange it defied belief. But that's for later. For now, let's linger here, in the glow of Susan Powell's life, in the shadow of her love, in the moment before everything changed. Because this is where it begins, with a woman who wanted a fairy tale, and a man who turned it into a nightmare. The sun barely crested the horizon on December 7, 2009, its pale light struggling to pierce the thick shroud of snow that had fallen overnight in West Valley City, Utah. The cul-de-sac where the Powells lived was still, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm. Houses hunkered down, driveways buried, the world holding its breath. Inside Susan Powell's home, the kitchen told a story frozen in time. A lump of dough sat abandoned on the counter, dusted with flour like a relic of the night before. The sink held a single unwashed plate, a spoon crusted with oatmeal. The Christmas lights strung along the windows blinked faintly, their cheer now hollow. Susan wasn't there to turn them off. She wasn't there at all. Across town, at the Wells Fargo office where Susan worked as a stockbroker, her desk sat empty. Her colleagues traded glances as the clock ticked past 9 a.m. Susan was never late. She was the one who arrived early, coffee in hand, her smile a jolt of warmth in the fluorescent-lit room. By 9:30, her supervisor dialed her cell. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. "Hey, Susan, it's Linda. Just checking in, you okay?" No answer came. At the daycare where Charlie and Braden usually spent their mornings, the staff noticed their absence too. No call, no note, just silence. Susan didn't miss drop-offs. She didn't miss anything. Back at the house, a neighbor named Debbie Caldwell peered out her window, her brow furrowing. The Powell's minivan wasn't in the driveway, and the garage door hung open, an oddity in the biting cold. Debbie had seen Susan the day before, bustling around with the boys, her laughter carrying across the yard. Now the stillness felt wrong. She pulled on her coat and trudged through the snow, knocking on the Powell's front door. No answer. She tried again, louder, her knuckles stinging against the wood. Nothing. By 10 a.m., unease had turned to alarm, and Debbie called Susan's friend Kiersey Helluel. "Something's off," she said, her voice tight. "Can you check on her?" Kiersey didn't hesitate. She'd known Susan since their boys were in diapers, shared playdates, late-night chats, secrets whispered over tea. Susan was her rock, the friend who'd drop everything to help. If she was missing work, missing daycare, something was seriously wrong. Kiersey bundled her own kids into the car and drove to the Powell house, her heart thudding as she pulled up. The scene matched Debbie's description. No minivan, garage gaping, snow undisturbed on the front steps. She pounded on the door, called Susan's name, then circled to the back. Through the kitchen window, she saw the dough, the plate, the lights, and no Susan. Panic clawed at her chest. She dialed 911. West Valley City Police arrived within the hour, their boots crunching through the snow as they surveyed the scene. Officer Ray Ellis knocked first, then tried the doorknob. Unlocked. He pushed it open, calling out, "Mrs. Powell? Mr. Powell? Anyone home?" Silence greeted him. Inside, the house felt like a snapshot, lived in but eerily still. The boys' toys littered the living room floor. A half-finished puzzle sprawled across the coffee table. Upstairs, Charlie and Braden's beds were unmade, blankets tangled as if they'd been yanked out in a hurry. Susan's purse sat on the hall table, her keys and phone inside. Her coat hung on its hook. Wherever she'd gone, she hadn't planned to leave. The cops fanned out, searching for clues. In the kitchen, they noted the dough, hardened now, a clock ticking backward to Susan's last moments. The fridge hummed, stocked with milk and leftovers. Downstairs, Josh's basement lair, a cluttered mess of computer parts and conspiracy books, sat untouched. No blood, no broken glass, no obvious signs of a struggle. Yet the absence screamed louder than any evidence. Susan wouldn't leave her boys. She wouldn't leave her life. Something or someone had taken her. By noon, the investigation kicked into gear. Police called Josh's cell. No answer. They pinged Susan's family, her parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, still in Washington state. "Have you heard from her?" an officer asked. Chuck's voice cracked as he said no, his gut twisting with dread. Susan's sisters rallied, phoning friends, co-workers, anyone who might know where she was. Word spread fast in the tight-knit Mormon community, and soon neighbors gathered outside the house, murmuring prayers, clutching coats against the wind. Kiersey stayed, her eyes fixed on the door, willing Susan to walk through it. Then, just after 2 p.m., the minivan rolled up. Josh Powell climbed out, his face blank, his dark hair mussed as if he'd slept in the car. Charlie and Braden tumbled from the back, their cheeks red from the cold, bundled in mismatched jackets. Officer Ellis approached, his notepad ready. "Mr. Powell, where's your wife?" Josh blinked, slow and deliberate, then shrugged. "I don't know," he said, his voice flat. "She was here when I left." What came next would stun everyone. Josh claimed he'd taken the boys camping, in the middle of the night, in a blizzard that had dumped a foot of snow across Utah. He said he'd woken up around midnight, restless, and decided on a whim to load Charlie and Braden into the minivan and drive to the West Desert, a barren stretch of dunes and scrubland an hour away. "We needed to get out," he told Ellis, his eyes darting to the side. "Tested the heater in the van, made some Came back this morning." He paused, then added, "Susan didn't want to come." She was tired. The story didn't land, it crashed. Ellis stared at him, pen frozen over the page. Camping? At midnight? With a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, in sub-zero temperatures with no warning to anyone? The desert was a frozen wasteland that night, winds howling, roads slick with ice. No one camped in that. And Susan, reliable, responsible Susan, hadn't mentioned any plans to Kiersey or Giovanna, who'd seen her hours before. Josh's hands were chapped, his boots clean, no mud, no sand, no trace of a campfire. The boys, shivering in thin coats, didn't chatter about esmores or stars. They just clung to his legs, quiet, their eyes wide. Where exactly did you go? Ellis pressed. Josh waved a hand vaguely. Out by Simpson Springs. Didn't mark it. The officer's jaw tightened. Simpson Springs was remote. A dot on a map with no cell service, no witnesses. Convenient if you wanted to hide something or someone. And Susan? Ellis asked again. Josh shrugged once more. Maybe she went to work. Maybe a friend picked her up. I don't know. The cops didn't buy it. Neither did Kiersey, who watched from the curb, her fists clenched. She'd read Susan's journals, heard her fears. If I die, Susan had written months earlier, the words trembling on the page. It may not be an accident. Josh, he's not who he seems. Now, as he stood there, deflecting questions with that hollow stare, Kiersey felt it in her bones. Josh knew more than he was saying. A lot more. The day stretched on, the snow falling harder, burying any hope of quick answers. Police cordoned off the house, called in detectives, and started pinging Josh's phone records. Neighbors whispered, their prayers turning to pleas. Susan was gone, vanished from a life she'd fought to hold together, a marriage that had trapped her in its coils. And Josh's blizzard of lies was just the beginning. Something terrible had happened in that house, something that left only echoes behind. The question was, could anyone prove it? The snow hadn't stopped falling on December 7th, 2009. It draped West Valley City, Utah in a heavy, suffocating quiet. Josh Powell stood in his driveway, hands buried deep in the pockets of his worn jacket. His breath puffed out in small clouds, curling into the freezing air. He didn't pace. He didn't cry. He didn't call out for Susan. Instead, he watched the police officers swarming his house with an eerie stillness. His dark eyes flicked from one face to another, calculating, unreadable. Officer Ray Ellis approached him, his boots crunching through the fresh snow. In his hand, a notepad bristled with scribbled notes from that absurd camping story Josh had spun earlier. "Mr. Powell, we need to talk," Ellis said. His voice was sharp, cutting through the muffled silence. Josh tilted his head, just a fraction. "Sure," he replied. His tone was flat, emotionless, like the frozen ground beneath him. "Let's go inside." The house buzzed with activity as they stepped through the door. Police officers moved methodically, dusting surfaces, snapping photos, bagging evidence. Susan's purse sat on the hall table, now sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Josh didn't glance at it. He walked to the living room and sank onto the couch. His legs crossed casually, hands folded in his lap. He looked comfortable. Too comfortable. Kiersey Helluel stood near the doorway, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She'd begged the police to let her stay, to be there when Susan came back. But Susan wasn't coming back. Not yet, maybe not ever. Kiersey's eyes locked on Josh. She'd seen Susan's fear, heard her whispered confessions about this man. Now, with Susan gone, Josh didn't seem shaken. He didn't seem scared. He seemed bored. Ellis pulled a chair from the dining room and sat across from Josh. His notepad flipped open, pen poised. "When did you last see your wife?" he asked. Josh shrugged. "Last night, before I left with the boys," he said. His voice was a monotone hum. "What time?" "Midnight, maybe a little after." He didn't blink. "And she was fine?" "Yeah." The word dropped like a stone, sinking into the silence. Ellis leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "Why didn't you call her when you got back and she wasn't here?" Josh paused. For the first time, a flicker crossed his face, brief, almost imperceptible. "I figured she went to work," he said. Ellis glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 3 p.m. now. Susan's shift at Wells Fargo started at 9 a.m. She'd been missing for hours. Josh's answer didn't just falter. It collapsed. Ellis pressed harder. She didn't take her phone, her purse, her keys. He gestured toward the evidence bags. How does she get to work without those? Josh shrugged again. Maybe she forgot them, he said. His voice stayed steady, unbothered. For work, Ellis snapped. His patience was fraying, his tone rising. Josh didn't flinch. Maybe, he repeated. His eyes drifted to the window, watching the snow pile higher. Ellis scribbled something, his pen scratching loud in the quiet. Then he dropped the next question, heavy and deliberate. We'd like you to come to the station. He paused, letting it sink in. Give a formal statement, help us figure this out. Josh's gaze snapped back to Ellis. His eyes narrowed just for a heartbeat. I don't think so, he said. I've got the boys to look after. He stood abruptly, brushing past Ellis like the conversation was a chore he'd finished. Ellis called after him. We can arrange childcare. His voice was firm, insistent. Josh didn't turn back. I'll think about it, he muttered. He didn't mean it. Kiersey watched him retreat to the kitchen, her fists clenched at her sides. She'd known Josh for years, seen him at church, at playdates at Susan's side. But this wasn't the Josh she knew. Or maybe it was. Maybe this was the real Josh, the one Susan had written about in her journal. If I die, it may not be an accident, she'd scribbled months ago. Kiersey had read those words, held the notebook in her hands. She'd promised Susan she'd keep it safe. Now those words echoed in her mind, loud and accusing. Josh knew where that journal was. He knew everything. The police didn't let up. They searched the house again, peeling back layers of the Powell's life. In the living room, an officer paused by the couch. A small electric fan sat on the floor, humming softly. It was pointed at the cushions, blowing cold air in a room already chilled. Odd. Very odd. The officer crouched down, peering closer. The cushions were damp, slightly but noticeably. A faint reddish stain streaked one corner, barely visible under the light. He waved over a detective. Take a look at this, he said. They photographed it, swabbed it, bagged the cushion. Later, tests would confirm it. Susan's blood. Not much, just a trace. Enough to raise questions, not enough to answer them. Ellis brought Josh back to the room. Any idea how blood got on the couch? He asked. Josh glanced at the spot, then away. Could have been a nosebleed, he said. Another shrug. Susan's nosebleeds? Maybe. His answers were a wall, short, solid, unyielding. Ellis stared at him, searching for a crack. There wasn't one. Not yet. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up to the nightmare. Giovanna Owings arrived, her face pale, her breath hitching. She'd been at the house the night before, dropping off a crochet project. Susan had been fine, chatty, warm, alive. Now she was gone. Giovanna pushed past the police tape, spotting Josh on the porch. Where's Susan? She shouted. Her voice cracked with desperation. Josh didn't meet her eyes. I don't know, he mumbled. He turned away, stepping back inside. Giovanna grabbed Kiersey's arm. He's lying, she hissed. I saw her yesterday, she was fine. Kiersey nodded, her throat tight. She remembered a moment months back. A church picnic, sunlight spilling over the grass. Susan laughing with a friend, a man, harmless, just talking. Josh had stormed over, his hand clamping around her arm. You're mine, he'd whispered. His voice was low, venomous. Susan had laughed it off, but her eyes had dimmed. Kiersey had seen the bruise later, faint purple against Susan's wrist. She hadn't forgotten. The day stretched into evening. Police tracked Josh's movements, or tried to. His phone records came back patchy. It had been off most of the night. One ping at 3 a.m. near the house. Nothing from the desert. No signal, no proof of his camping tale. Just a void where his story should have been. Detectives gathered in the driveway, their voices hushed. He's not acting like a worried husband, one said. He's acting like a suspect. Another nodded. No tears, no panic. Just nothing. But acting wasn't evidence. Susan's purse, her phone, her keys, all left behind, screamed she hadn't walked away. Her blood on the couch whispered something darker. Yet Josh's calm held firm. He moved through the house like a ghost. He fed the boys dinner, macaroni from a box dumped into bowls. No words, no warmth as they ate in silence. The phone rang, Chuck and Judy Cox, Susan's parents, calling from Washington. Their voices broke over the line, begging for news. Josh didn't pick up. He didn't join the neighbors outside, lighting candles in the snow. He didn't search for his wife. He just sat, staring at the wall, his mask locked in place. Kiersey stayed late, watching him through the kitchen window. The snow glowed under the streetlights, casting shadows across his face. She thought of Susan's journal, hidden somewhere in that house. "If I die, it may not be an accident," Susan had written. "Josh, he's not who he seems." Kiersey felt it now, a certainty sinking into her bones. Josh wasn't just hiding something. He was hiding everything. The night deepened. The snow piled higher, burying the world outside. Police left with questions, not answers. Josh locked the door, the boys asleep upstairs. Somewhere out there, Susan was missing. Maybe alive, maybe not. And the man who should have been tearing the world apart to find her was already crafting his next move. His mask didn't slip. Not yet, but it would. The snow outside Susan Powell's house had stopped falling by the evening of December 7, 2009. Inside, the silence was heavier than the drifts piling up on the lawn. Josh sat alone, the boys asleep upstairs, while police lights flashed through the windows. Susan was gone. Her absence echoed through the rooms she'd once filled with light. But to understand where she went, or what took her, you have to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to a love that promised everything and delivered something else entirely. Susan Cox met Joshua Powell in the fall of 2000. She was 19, a dreamer with a heart wide open. He was 24, quiet, intense, a puzzle she wanted to solve. They crossed paths at a church event in Puyallup, Washington. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was their shared anchor. Susan, with her chestnut hair and bright green eyes, glowed in the crowd. Josh stood apart, his dark hair falling over his forehead, his gaze steady. He didn't say much that night, but he watched her, and Susan noticed. Their first conversation was simple: faith, family, the future. Susan loved to talk, her words spilling out like sunlight. Josh listened, nodding, his responses short but deliberate. She saw depth in his silence. He saw something in her he wanted to claim. They started dating soon after. Susan fell fast. She'd always wanted a fairy tale, a husband, a home, a forever. Josh seemed to fit the script. He wasn't loud or flashy like the boys she'd known in high school. He was serious, focused, different. Her family wasn't so sure. Chuck Cox, her father, met Josh and felt a prickle of unease. "He's too possessive," Chuck said once, watching Josh hover near Susan. Judy, her mother, agreed. "He doesn't smile," she whispered. But Susan brushed it off. "He's shy," she told them. "He just needs time." In April 2001, less than a year after they met, they married. Susan designed her own wedding dress. White lace, flowing, a vision of hope. The ceremony was small, held in a Mormon temple. She beamed as she walked down the aisle. Josh stood waiting, his face blank. Friends said he looked proud. Family said he looked distant. The early years were soft, almost sweet. They moved to Utah, a fresh start in a Mormon heartland. Susan threw herself into building a life. She decorated their first apartment with thrift store finds, floral curtains, a rickety table. Josh worked IT jobs, tinkering with computers in his spare time. They laughed sometimes, shared quiet nights. Susan thought it was enough. Then Charlie came in 2005, a boy with her eyes and his father's dark hair. Susan was overjoyed. She sang to him, rocked him, filled scrapbooks with his tiny milestones. Josh was quieter about it. He held Charlie, sure, but his focus stayed elsewhere, his screens, his projects. Braden followed in 2007. Another son, another burst of light for Susan. She juggled motherhood with grace, her love endless. Josh started to pull back. The cracks began small. Money was the first fight. Susan got a job at Wells Fargo, a stockbroker gig she loved. She was good at it, smart, charming, and natural. Josh hated it. He didn't like her working. He didn't like her earning more than him. "Who's watching the boys?" he'd snap. "I am," she'd say, her voice firm. "We need this." He took over the finances anyway. Every penny went through him. Susan had to beg for grocery money. She'd show receipts, explain every dime. He'd scowl, accuse her of overspending. It wasn't about the money. It was about control. The fights grew louder. Neighbors heard them through the thin walls. Susan's voice pleading, "Let me breathe, Josh." His cold, "You don't need anyone else." He didn't like her friends. Kiersey Helluel saw it firsthand. She'd visit and Josh would hover. He'd interrupt, steer Susan away. Once at a ward picnic, he grabbed her arm. She'd been laughing with a man, a friend, nothing more. Josh's face darkened. "You're mine," he hissed. His grip left a mark. Susan laughed it off later. "He's just protective," she told Kiersey. But her eyes said something else. The isolation tightened. Josh didn't want her at church events without him. He didn't want her calling her sisters. Denise, Susan's older sister, noticed the shift. "She stopped answering my calls," Denise said later. "I'd get Josh instead. He'd say Susan was busy. She wasn't. She was trapped. Susan tried to fix it. That's who she was, a fixer. She suggested counseling. Josh refused. Therapists are liars, he said. She pushed for date nights. He'd sit across from her, silent, picking at his food. She prayed harder. Her faith was her lifeline. "God can save us," she'd whisper to herself. But God didn't change Josh. He got worse. By 2009, the man she'd married was a stranger. He quit his job, leaving her to carry the bills. Yet he still controlled every dollar. He locked himself in the basement. Hours down there, hunched over his computer. Conspiracy theories, dark websites, his new obsession. Susan found printouts once, ramblings about government plots. "What is this?" she asked. "Mind your business," he snapped. The temper flared more often. He threw a chair once, shattering a lamp. Charlie cried upstairs. Susan stood frozen, her hands shaking. Another time, he grabbed her wrist. Hard. She pulled away, but the bruise stayed. "I'm scared," she told Denise over the phone. Her voice was a whisper. "He's not the man I married." Denise begged her to leave. "Take the boys and come to us," she said. Susan hesitated. "I can't," she said. "He'd never let me take them." She wrote it all down. A spiral notebook hidden in a drawer. Her fears, her fights, her fading hope. "I want to leave," she scribbled. "But the boys, I can't lose them. What if he hurts me? What if he hurts them?" The words trembled on the page. She showed it to Kiersey once. "If anything happens to me," Susan said, "give this to the police." Kiersey nodded, tears in her eyes. "I won't let you down," she promised. Back to December 6, 2009, the night before she vanished. Susan cooked dinner, spaghetti, the boys' favorite. She laughed with Giovanna Owings, who stopped by. Josh was there, quiet, watching. Giovanna left at 5 p.m. Susan tucked the boys in at 8. Josh stayed downstairs. The TV flickered, casting shadows. What happened after, no one knows. But the marriage, the love that had started so bright, had turned to ash. Susan wanted out. Josh wouldn't let her go. Not alive, maybe. The next day she was gone. Her journal stayed hidden. Her fears stayed silent. And Josh stayed in control. For now. The sun hung low over West Valley City, Utah on December 7, 2009. Its weak light barely warmed the snow-crusted streets. Susan Powell was missing. Her house stood quiet, a crime scene now, cordoned off with yellow tape. Inside, the kitchen held echoes of her last night, dough on the counter, a plate in the sink. Outside, the community stirred. Word spread fast. Susan didn't show up for work. She didn't drop the boys at daycare. She didn't answer her phone. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Kiersey Helluel stood on the Powell's lawn, her breath fogging in the cold. She'd called the police hours ago, her voice shaking. Now she watched officers move in and out of the house. Her best friend was gone. Susan, sunshine incarnate, mother of 2, wasn't where she belonged. Kiersey's stomach churned. She glanced at Josh Powell. He leaned against the minivan, arms crossed, face blank. He didn't call out for Susan. He didn't join the neighbors gathering nearby. He just stood there. Kiersey's mind flashed to Susan's words. "Love me like I love you," Susan had written in a letter once, tucked into her journal. Josh hadn't. Not even close. The police were already digging. Officer Ray Ellis briefed a growing team. "We've got a missing woman, 28, 2 kids in the husband's custody," he said. "Last seen last night." His eyes flicked to Josh. The husband's story doesn't add up. Josh had claimed a midnight camping trip. In a blizzard. With Charlie 4 and Braden 2. To Simpson Springs, an hour away in the West Desert. No one bought it. Not Ellis. Not the detectives. Not the neighbors whispering behind gloved hands. By late afternoon, the search kicked off. Volunteers poured in. Church friends, co-workers, strangers who'd heard the news. They met at the Ward House, a squat brick building down the street. Tables groaned with coffee urns and flyers. Susan's face stared back from the pages, smiling, green eyes bright. "Missing, Susan Powell," the text read. Last seen December 6, 2009. Please call with any information. Kiersey took a stack. She handed them out, her hands trembling. We'll find her, she told a woman beside her. She didn't know if she believed it. Police split the effort. One team stayed at the house. They combed every inch, closets, basement, garage. Susan's purse, keys, and phone were still there. Her coat hung on its hook. She hadn't left willingly. That much was clear. Another team headed west. The west desert loomed, a frozen expanse of dunes and sagebrush. Josh said he'd camped there. Simpson Springs was the target, a remote spot, barely a dot on the map. Detectives piled into SUVs, tires crunching snow. Volunteers followed in pickups, bundled in coats and scarves. The wind held out there. Temperatures had dipped below zero the night before. No one camped in that. Josh didn't join them. He stayed home with the boys. I need to take care of them, he told Ellis. His voice was flat, rehearsed. Ellis stared at him. You're not worried about your wife? Josh shrugged. She'll turn up, he said. He turned away. Kiersey overheard. Her blood boiled. Susan had begged him for love, for trust. He'd given her control, isolation, fear. Now she was gone, and he didn't care. The desert search stretched into dusk. Flashlights bobbed across the snow. Boots sank into drifts. Voices called Susan's name. Susan! Susan, can you hear us? The wind swallowed their cries. Simpson Springs was a ghost town. A rusted sign, a few picnic tables, nothing else. No campfire ashes. No tire tracks from the minivan. No sign Josh had been there. A detective kicked at the snow. This is bullshit, he muttered. His partner nodded. He's lying. Back in town, the effort grew. Susan's family arrived. Chuck and Judy Cox drove from Washington, their faces drawn. They hugged Kiersey, tears freezing on their cheeks. Where's my girl? Judy whispered. Chuck clenched his fists. Josh knows something, he said. He'd never trusted him. Not since the wedding, when Josh's grip on Susan felt too tight. The Coxes joined the volunteers. They knocked on doors, handed out flyers. Neighbors opened up. I heard them fighting, one said. Last week, he yelled, she cried. Another nodded. He's strange. Keeps to himself. The picture sharpened. Susan's life wasn't the idol it seemed. Her love for Josh had been a chain. Night fell. The desert team returned, hands empty. We found nothing, a detective told Ellis. No tracks, no campsite. Ellis rubbed his face. Check the minivan, he said. Forensics swarmed it. The seats were clean. No mud, no sand, no melted snow. Josh's boots were spotless too. His story unraveled. But he didn't budge. I was there, he insisted. His eyes were cold, unblinking. Police pressed the boys. Charlie and Braden sat in the living room, toys scattered around. A social worker knelt beside them. Did you go camping? She asked. Charlie nodded. Daddy drove us, he said. His voice was small. Where's Mommy? She went away, he said. Braden sucked his thumb, silent. The worker frowned. They were too young. Their words were muddled, unreliable. Josh watched from the doorway. His face stayed blank. Kiersey saw it. She remembered Susan's pleas. Protect my boys, she'd said once. Josh wasn't protecting them. He was using them. The search widened. Helicopters buzzed overhead, blades slicing the dark. Their spotlights swept the desert. Nothing. Ground teams checked landfills, ditches, backroads. Flyers plastered every pole, every shop window. Susan's face was everywhere. Her smile haunted the town. Chuck called her phone again. Straight to voicemail. Susan, honey, it's Dad, he said. Please come home. His voice broke. Judy clung to him, sobbing. They prayed. The ward held a vigil. Candles flickered in the snow. Hymns rose, soft and mournful. Abide with me, they sang. Kiersey stood among them. Her eyes burned with tears. Susan should have been there. She loved these nights. Josh didn't show. He stayed inside. Lights off, curtains drawn. A neighbor peeked through. He's just sitting there, she said. Doing nothing. The clock ticked past midnight. December 8th dawned gray and cold. The search didn't stop. Volunteers regrouped. Police planned a press conference. We're treating this as suspicious, Ellis told reporters. Cameras flashed. Susan's story hit the news. Utah mother missing, the headlines screamed. The nation watched. Kiersey spoke. Susan's out there, she said. We won't give up. Her voice trembled. She meant it, but doubt crept in. Josh's silence was deafening. His lack of panic was a spotlight. Susan had loved him. She'd begged him to love her back. He hadn't. Now she was gone. And he wasn't looking. The desert held no answers. The house held secrets. The search went on. But time was slipping. Susan was slipping. And Josh knew more than he'd ever say. The night of December 7th, 2009, had bled into the early hours of December 8th. West Valley City, Utah, was a ghost town under its snowy shroud. Susan Powell's house glowed with artificial light. Police floodlights bathed the yard, casting long shadows. Inside, the search for answers grew desperate. Officers moved like specters, their voices low. Susan was still missing. Her boys slept upstairs, unaware. Josh Powell sat in the kitchen, a cup of cold coffee untouched. His face was a mask, blank, unyielding. The community outside prayed. Candles flickered in the snow. But inside, something shifted. A clue emerged. It started with Officer Mike Tanner. He'd been assigned to the living room. The space felt frozen in time. Toys littered the floor, Charlie's trucks, Braden's blocks. A half-finished puzzle sprawled across the coffee table. Susan's touch lingered here. Her warmth. Her absence screamed louder. Tanner paced, his flashlight sweeping the shadows. Then he stopped. A small electric fan sat on the carpet. It hummed softly, blowing air across the couch. Odd. The room was already cold. The heat was off. Why a fan? He crouched down. The cushions caught his eye. They were damp. Slightly, but unmistakably. He leaned closer. A faint reddish stain streaked one corner. Barely visible, like a whisper on the fabric. His pulse quickened. He waved over Detective Sarah Klein. "Take a look at this," he said. His voice was tight. Klein knelt beside him. Her flashlight beam narrowed on the stain. It was small, smaller than a dime. But it was there. Red-brown, irregular, unmistakable. "Blood?" she asked. "Could be," Tanner said. "They didn't touch it. Not yet. They called forensics." The team arrived fast. White suits rustled as they descended. Cameras clicked, capturing the couch from every angle. A tech swabbed the stain. The cotton tip darkened, absorbing the trace. Another sprayed luminol. The room dimmed. A faint blue glow bloomed where the stain met the spray. Positive. Blood confirmed. The air thickened. Klein radioed Ellis. "We've got something," she said. Living room couch. Ellis arrived, his face grim. He stared at the stain. "Is it hers?" he asked. "We'll know soon," the tech replied. The swab went into a tube. The tube went into a bag. The bag went to the lab. Josh was summoned. He shuffled in from the kitchen. His hands stayed in his pockets. Ellis pointed to the couch. "Any idea how blood got here?" he asked. Josh glanced at it. His eyes flicked away. "Could have been a nosebleed," he said. His voice was flat. "Susan's nosebleeds?" "Maybe." He shrugged. That damn shrug again. Ellis's jaw tightened. "When?" Josh paused. "Dunno," he said. "Sometimes she gets them." He turned away. Klein watched him go. "He's lying," she whispered. Ellis nodded. "He knows more than he's saying." The lab worked fast. By morning, results trickled in. DNA matched. It was Susan's blood. Not much, just a trace. A few drops, diluted, cleaned. But it was hers. The news hit like a punch. Kiersey Helluel stood outside, flyers in hand. Ellis pulled her aside. "We found blood," he said. Her knees buckled. "Susan's?" she asked. Her voice cracked. "Yeah." She clutched the flyers tighter. Tears streaked her face. "Where is she?" she whispered. Ellis didn't answer. He didn't know. The blood wasn't enough. No pool, no splatter. No proof of violence. Just a stain. Cleaned, but not well enough. Forensics dug deeper. The fan was key. It had been running since they arrived. Someone turned it on. Someone wanted the couch dry. The dampness suggested timing. Hours old, not days. Susan was last seen the night before. The math lined up. Too well. They questioned Josh again. "Why's the fan on?" Klein asked. He shrugged. "It's warm in here," he said. Ellis stared. "It's freezing," he snapped. "The heat's off." Josh didn't blink. "Felt warm to me," he said. His lies stacked higher. The couch went to the lab. Tex tore it apart. More traces, under cushions and seams. Tiny droplets missed by the cleaner. All Susan's. No other DNA. No struggle marks. No torn fabric. Just blood. And that fan. Police widened the scope. They searched the house again. Every room, every corner. The basement, Josh's domain, yielded nothing. Computer parts, conspiracy books, dust. No blood, no weapons. The kitchen held the dough. Hardened now, a silent witness. Upstairs, the boys' room was chaos. Blankets tangled, toys strewn. Susan's coat still hung by the door. Her phone buzzed in its evidence bag. Missed calls, Chuck, Judy Kiersey. Josh didn't check it. He didn't care. Kiersey remembered a fight. Months back, Susan had called her. He grabbed me, Susan said. Her voice shook. Hard my arm. Kiersey had seen the bruise. Purple, stark against her skin. He's getting worse, Susan whispered. I'm scared. Kiersey had urged her to leave. Susan stayed. For the boys. For hope. Now that bruise haunted Kiersey. Was the blood another mark? The search outside pressed on. Desert teams returned empty. Helicopters buzzed useless. Volunteers pounded pavement. Flyers multiplied. Susan's face stared from every pole. Chuck Cox faced the press. My daughter's missing, he said. His voice broke. We need help. Judy clung to him. Her sobs were silent. Josh stayed inside. He fed the boys cereal. He ignored the chaos. Neighbors watched him. He's not looking, one said. He's not even trying. The blood-stain gnawed at Ellis. It wasn't enough. Not to arrest. Not to charge. Circumstantial, the lawyers would say. A nosebleed, Josh claimed. No body, no crime. Yet it screamed. Susan didn't vanish. She didn't walk away. Something happened. In that house. On that couch. The lab pushed harder. Microscopes hummed. More tests, cleaning agents. Bleach traces on the fabric. Faint, but there. Someone scrubbed. Not well enough. Josh's hands were clean. No cuts, no stains. But his story wasn't. Police circled back. Did you clean the couch? Klein asked. Josh frowned. No, he said. Why? Blood, she said. He shrugged. Must have been old, he said. Ellis slammed his notepad down. Stop lying, he snapped. Josh didn't flinch. I'm not, he said. His eyes were ice. The day dragged on. December 8th faded to night. The blood stain lingered. A clue, not a conclusion. Susan's family prayed. Kiersey held her journal. If I die, Susan had written, it may not be an accident. The words burned. Josh knew. He had to. But the stain stayed silent. The law stayed still. Susan stayed gone. And the search stumbled forward. Into the dark. The snow had settled into a hard crust over West Valley City by December 9, 2009. Susan Powell's disappearance stretched into its third day. Her house remained a hive of police activity. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. Inside, the blood stain on the couch gnawed at investigators. Outside, volunteers trudged through the cold, flyers in hand. Susan's face was everywhere. Her smile a ghost on every pole. Josh Powell stayed inside. He fed Charlie and Braden oatmeal. He ignored the ringing phone. He ignored the world. But the world wasn't ignoring him. And neither was his family. Stephen Powell lived in Puyallup, Washington. Josh's father. A man with graying hair and a sharp, unblinking stare. He'd been a shadow in Susan and Josh's life. Distant but present. Now, with Susan gone, he emerged. He called Josh that morning. I saw the news, Stephen said. His voice was low, raspy. What happened? Josh's reply was curt. She's missing, he said. That's all. Stephen didn't push. Not yet. But he booked a flight. He'd be in Utah by nightfall. Police didn't know it then. Stephen was more than a concerned father. He was a piece of the puzzle. A dark one. Susan had met Stephen early in her marriage. Back in 2001, when she and Josh were newlyweds. They'd lived with him briefly. A small house in Puyallup, cluttered with junk. Stephen was divorced, estranged from most of his kids. Josh was his favorite. Susan didn't like him. He watched her. Too long, too close. She'd catch him staring across the dinner table. His eyes lingered. She'd shift, uncomfortable. He's weird, she told Josh once. Her voice was hushed. Josh shrugged. That's just Dad, he said. She let it go. But it didn't stop. Stephen's interest grew. He'd brush past her in the hall. His hand grazed her arm. Accidental, he'd say. Susan didn't buy it. She started locking the bathroom door. She showered fast. She told Kiersey later. He gives me the creeps, she said. Her skin crawled. They moved out after 6 months. Utah was their escape. Susan thought distance would fix it. It didn't. Stephen visited. He'd show up unannounced, a duffel bag in hand, a grin on his face. "Miss my grandkids," he'd say. But his eyes stayed on Susan. She'd wear baggy clothes around him. She'd avoid being alone. Josh didn't notice, or didn't care. Stephen's visits stretched longer. A week here, 2 there. Susan confided in her sister Denise. "He's obsessed," she said. Her voice trembled. "He talks about me like I'm his." Denise frowned. "Tell Josh," she urged. Susan tried. "He won't listen," she said. "He defends him." The obsession deepened. Stephen kept journals, pages of scrawl, hidden in his room. Police would find them later. "I love Susan," he wrote. "She's perfect. Josh doesn't deserve her." He fantasized. Detailed graphic entries. Susan cooking, laughing, breathing. He watched her through windows. He took photos. Secret shots, Susan in the yard, Susan with the boys. She didn't know. He recorded her. Audio tapes stashed in a box. Her voice soft and unaware. Singing to Charlie, talking to Josh. "I could listen to her forever," he wrote. It was sick. It was real. Back to December 9th. Stephen landed in Salt Lake City. He rented a car. He drove to West Valley. Josh let him in. No hug, no warmth. Just a nod. Stephen dropped his bag in the living room. He glanced at the couch. The blood stain was gone. Police had taken it. He didn't ask. "Where's Susan?" he said. Josh shrugged. "Dunno," he replied. Stephen's eyes narrowed. He stayed quiet. Police noticed him the next day. December 10th. A neighbor tipped them off. "Josh's dad's here," she said. "He's creepy." Ellis sent a detective. Detective Paul Hayes knocked. Stephen answered. Gray hair, thin lips, a stare that pierced. "Who are you?" Hayes asked. "Susan Powell," he said. "Josh's father." Hayes jotted it down. "Why were you here?" "Family emergency," Stephen said. His tone was smooth. Too smooth. Hayes didn't like him. Something was off. The investigation churned. The blood stain wasn't enough. No arrest yet. But Stephen's arrival raised flags. They dug into his past. Divorce records, complaints. A pattern emerged. Obsession. Control. Like father, like son. Susan's journals surfaced. Kiersey handed them over. Police read her words. "Stephen watches me," she wrote. "I feel trapped. Josh won't stop him." The pieces clicked. A toxic triangle. Josh's control. Stephen's fixation. Susan caught between. Police searched deeper. They got a warrant. Not for Utah yet. For Puyallup. Stephen's house. Days later, they raided it. December 12th. Boxes piled high. Junk everywhere. Then they found it. The stash. Photos of Susan. Hundreds. Candid, stolen moments. Tapes labeled Susan. Her voice trapped on cassette. Journals spilling his thoughts. "I'd take her from Josh," he wrote. "She'd be mine." The detectives recoiled. "This guy's unhinged," one said. They bagged it all. Evidence. Not of murder. Of madness. Back in Utah, Stephen stayed close. He hovered near Josh. He watched the police. He didn't search for Susan. He didn't cry. He asked Josh once. "What really happened?" Josh stared at him. "Nothing," he said. Stephen smirked. "I believe you," he said. His voice dripped. Police questioned him. December 11th. "Where were you December 6th? Hayes asked. "Home," Stephen said. "Washington." "Alone?" "Yeah. No alibi check yet. Too far." They pressed. "Did you talk to Susan?" "No," he said. His eyes flicked. "A lie. Maybe." "Did Josh?" "Dunno," Stephen said. He leaned back. Unfazed. Hayes pushed. "You close to Susan?" Stephen paused. "She's family," he said. His lips twitched. Hayes wrote it down. "Bullshit," he muttered later. The community buzzed. Rumors flew. "Josh's dad's a pervert," a neighbor said. Kiersey heard. She remembered Susan's fear. "He's part of this," she told Ellis. Ellis nodded. "Maybe," he said. "But no proof." Not yet. The blood lingered. The search faltered. Stephen's secret twisted it all. Susan trapped by 2 men. Josh's jealousy. Stephen's lust. Both toxic. Both deadly? December 12th dawned. Stephen stayed. Josh stayed silent. Susan stayed gone. The house held its breath. The tapes whispered her name, and the mystery darkened. The snow outside Susan Powell's house had hardened into ice by December 10th, 2009. West Valley City was a frozen tableau. Susan had been missing for 4 days. Her absence was a wound, raw and gaping. Police swarmed the cul-de-sac. Their radios crackled in the cold. Inside, the house held its secrets. Josh Powell moved through it like a shadow. He cooked eggs for Charlie and Braden. He didn't speak. His father, Stephen, lounged in the living room. His presence thickened the air. The blood stain was gone, taken by forensics. The fan was silent now, but the boys were awake. Charlie, with his dark hair and wide eyes. Braden, too, clutching a stuffed bear. They were the only witnesses. The only ones left from that night. Police knew it. Kiersey Helluel knew it. Susan's family knew it. The children held the truth. If only they could tell it. Detective Sarah Klein sat in the living room that morning. A social worker, Lisa Grant, knelt beside her. Toys littered the carpet, trucks, blocks, a puzzle half done. Susan's touch lingered here. Her boys played quietly. Charlie pushed a truck in circles. Braden chewed his bear's ear. Josh watched from the doorway. His arms crossed. His face blank. Klein nodded to Grant. "Let's talk to them," she said. Her voice was soft. Grant smiled at the boys. "Hey guys," she said. "Wanna chat?" Charlie looked up. His eyes were Susan's, green, searching. Braden hugged his bear tighter. Grant sat on the floor. She pulled a toy truck closer. "Did you go somewhere with Daddy?" she asked. Charlie nodded. "Camping," he said. His voice was small. Klein leaned in. "When?" she asked. "Night," Charlie said. He didn't look at her. Grant kept it light. "Was it fun?" Charlie shrugged. "Daddy drove us," he said. Braden mumbled. "Cold," he said. His word barely formed. Josh shifted. His boots scuffed the floor. Klein glanced at him. His jaw tightened. "Where's Mommy?" Grant asked. Her tone stayed gentle. Charlie paused. His truck stopped. "Mommy went away," he said. He stared at the carpet. Braden nodded. "Away," he echoed. Klein's pen froze over her notepad. Her heart sank. "Where'd she go?" Grant pressed. Charlie frowned. "Dunno," he said. "Daddy said she's gone." Braden sucked his thumb. His bear dangled. Josh stepped forward. "They're tired," he said. His voice cut through. Grant looked up. "We're almost done," she said. He didn't move. Klein wrote fast. "Mommy went away. Daddy drove us." The words looped in her mind. Too vague. Too heavy. The boys were too young. 4 and 2. Their stories wobbled. Police had seen this before. Kids as witnesses. Unreliable, fragile. But these kids lived it. That night. December 6th. Susan's last night. Grant tried again. "Was Mommy with you?" she asked. Charlie shook his head. "No," he said. She stayed. Braden rocked. "Mommy," he whispered. His voice broke. Josh loomed closer. "Enough," he said. His tone hardened. Klein stood. "We need this," she said. "For Susan." Josh's eyes narrowed. "They don't know anything," he said. He scooped Braden up. Charlie followed. The interview ended. Klein watched them go. Her gut twisted. "They know something," she told Grant. Grant nodded. "But they can't say it." The boys' silence screamed. Susan had loved them. Her world spun around them. Kiersey remembered her voice. "My boys are everything," Susan had said. She'd sung to them. Lullabies in the dark. She'd prayed over them. Tiny hands clasped in hers. Josh didn't. He'd ignored them. Susan had told Kiersey once. "He doesn't play with them," she said. "He's too busy. Busy in the basement. Busy with his screens. Busy with control." Their fights echoed it. "You don't care," Susan had shouted. Her voice cracked. "They're mine too," Josh snapped back. But he didn't show it. Not then. Not now. Police regrouped. Ellis called a meeting. "We need more from the kids," he said. His voice was gravel. Klein shook her head. "They're too little," she said. Charlie's vague. "Braden barely talks." Ellis rubbed his face. "Josh is coaching them," he said. Grant agreed. "He's hovering," she said. "Shutting them down." They called a child psychologist. Dr. Emily Voss arrived that afternoon. December 10th. She met the boys in a quiet room. Away from Josh. Away from Stephen. Toys spread out. A safe space. She sat with Charlie first. "Tell me about camping," she said. Her voice was warm. Charlie fidgeted. Daddy took us, he said. In the van. Was it dark? Yeah. He twisted his shirt. Where'd you go? Dunno, he said. Far. Voss nodded. And Mommy? She didn't come, he said. She was home. Then what? Charlie shrugged. We came back, he said. She wasn't there. His eyes dropped. Voss watched him. Fear? Confusion? Both. She turned to Braden. He clung to his bear. Hi, sweetie, she said. Did you see Mommy? Braden shook his head. Mommy gone, he said. His voice trembled. When? Night, he said. Voss wrote it down. Consistent. But cloudy. Josh's story held. Camping. Midnight. Blizzard. Susan left behind. The boys confirmed it. Sort of. Police dug deeper. They pulled Josh in. December 11th. Did the boys see anything? Ellis asked. Josh leaned back. No, he said. They slept. In the van. Yeah. His eyes didn't waver. Ellis pressed. They said Mommy went away. Josh shrugged. I told them that, he said. When we got back. Ellis stared. You told them? Yeah. No emotion. No crack. The boy's words were his. Parroted. Police couldn't break it. Not yet. Susan's love lingered. Her journal told it. I'd die for my boys, she'd written. Her ink stained with tears. Josh's neglect told it too. He'd fought her. Over them. You're too soft, he'd said. Her voice had risen. You're too cold. The rift grew. Now the boys were caught. Their silence was a wall. Charlie played. Braden rocked. Their mother was gone. Their father was stone. Stephen watched it all. He smirked from the couch. Kids don't know, he said. His voice slithered. Police didn't trust him. His tapes, Susan's voice, haunted them. The search faltered. Desert teams found nothing. Flyers faded in the snow. The boys stayed quiet. December 12th dawned. Voss met them again. Anything else? She asked. Charlie shook his head. Braden hugged his bear. Mommy, he whispered. A plea. A memory. Susan's love held them. Josh's shadow loomed. The truth stayed locked. In their silence. In his lies. And Susan stayed lost. The new year crept in cold and gray over West Valley City, Utah. It was January 2010. Susan Powell had been missing for nearly a month. Her disappearance hung like a fog. Police still swarmed her house. The blood stain lingered in their reports. Charlie and Braden's cryptic words echoed. Josh Powell stayed silent. His father, Stephen, stayed close. Too close. The investigation churned. No body. No arrest. Just questions. Then Josh made a move. Not a search. Not a plea. A retreat. He packed up. January 10th, 2010. The minivan sat in the driveway. Boxes piled in the back. Charlie and Braden's toys stuffed in bags. He didn't tell the police. He didn't tell Susan's family. He told no one. He was leaving. Washington State. Puyallup. Stephen's house. His sanctuary. Kiersey Helluel saw it first. She drove by that morning. Her heart sank. The garage door was open. Josh loaded the van. Charlie clung to his leg. Braden sat on the pavement, bear in hand. What's he doing? She muttered. She pulled over. Josh, she called. Her voice trembled. He didn't look up. Moving, he said. His tone was flat. To Washington? Yeah. Why? Fresh start, he said. He shoved a box in. Kiersey's stomach twisted. Susan was missing. Not dead, not proven. He wasn't looking. He was running. She called Chuck Cox. Susan's father picked up fast. He's leaving, Kiersey said. What? Chuck's voice cracked. Washington. With the boys. Chuck swore. Judy sobbed in the background. They'd been fighting for answers. Now they fought for their grandsons. Josh didn't wait. By noon, the van was gone. The house stood empty. A neighbor tipped police. Ellis got the call. He's bolted, the neighbor said. Ellis slammed his desk. To where? Washington, they think. Detectives scrambled. They tracked the van. Interstate 15, then 84. Heading northwest. Puyallup bound. Stephen led the way. His car ahead, Josh behind. A convoy of secrets. Police couldn't stop him. No charges. No warrant. Just suspicion. The Coxes acted fast. Chuck called a lawyer. We want custody, he said. His voice shook. Those boys aren't safe. Judy nodded. Josh knows what happened, she said. He's hiding it. The lawyer filed papers. Emergency custody motion. Filed in Utah. They argued danger. The blood stain. The camping lie. Stephen's tapes. Josh's silence. All of it. Josh arrived in Puyallup. January 11th. Stephen's house was a mess. Piles of junk, boxes, papers, old furniture. The air smelled stale. Charlie and Braden wandered in, their toys dumped in a corner. Josh sat up in the basement. Stephen grinned. "Home sweet home," he said. His eyes glinted. Police followed. West Valley detectives called Puyallup PD. "He's here," Ellis said. "Suspect in a missing person case." Puyallup cops staked out the house. A squat brown ranch style. Curtains drawn. No sign of Susan. The Coxes arrived. January 13th. They drove from Washington's coast. Chuck pounded on Stephen's door. "Let me see them," he demanded. Stephen answered. His smirk was sharp. "They're fine," he said. "Where's Susan?" Judy cried. Stephen shrugged. "Dunno," he said. Josh appeared. "Get off my property," he said. His voice was ice. Chuck lunged. Judy pulled him back. "Not like this," she whispered. They left. Empty-handed. The custody fight flared. Court hearings began. January 20th, Utah. The Coxes pleaded. "Josh is a flight risk," their lawyer said. "He's unstable." Josh's lawyer countered. "No proof," he said. "He's their father." The judge hesitated. Evidence was thin. Blood, yes. Lies, yes. But no body. No conviction. The boys stayed with Josh. Chuck's fists clenched. "He's taking them from us," he said. Judy wept. Like he took her. Police dug in Puyallup. They watched the house. Josh rarely left. Stephen did. He shopped, smirked at cops. They searched his car. Nothing. The tapes haunted them. Susan's voice trapped. Her fear of Stephen. Her fear of Josh. Kiersey flew up. January 25th. She faced Josh. "Let me see them," she said. He blocked the door. "No," he said. "They're mine." His eyes were steel. She saw Charlie inside. He waved, small and sad. Braden peeked out. "Kiersey," he mumbled. Josh shut the door. Her heart broke. Susan's boys. Her world. Now his pawns. The Coxes pushed harder. Another hearing. February 1st. They brought Susan's journal. "Josh controls everything," they read. The boys too. The judge listened. Josh sat stone-faced. Stephen beside him. Custody stayed. Supervised visits granted. Chuck and Judy got hours. Not days. They met the boys. February 5th. A park in Puyallup. Charlie ran to them. "Grandpa," he shouted. Braden toddled over. Judy hugged them tight. Tears soaked their coats. "Where's Mommy?" Charlie asked. Chuck knelt. "We're looking," he said. His voice broke. Josh watched. A social worker nearby. He didn't speak. The visits were tense. Josh hovered. He cut them short. "Time's up," he'd say. His grip on the boys tightened. Like his grip on Susan. Police pressed. They searched Puyallup. Landfills, woods, rivers. Nothing. Josh's control held. He silenced the boys. "Daddy says don't talk," Charlie told Voss. The psychologist. Braden nodded. "Daddy," he whispered. The Coxes fought on. February 10th. Another motion. More evidence. Stephen's obsession. Josh's flight. The judge wavered. Still no ruling. Susan's love lingered. Her journal screamed it. "My boys are my heart," she wrote. Josh's shadow loomed. He'd isolated her. Now them. The move was a wall. A fortress. Puyallup closed in. February 15th. The search faded. Police pulled back. The Coxes clung to hope. Kiersey clung to the journal. Josh clung to power. Susan stayed gone. The boys stayed silent. And the fight stretched on. The air in Puyallup, Washington, hung heavy with dampness on February 1st, 2010. A gray mist clung to the trees. Susan Powell had been missing for 56 days. Her absence was a splinter under the skin of everyone who loved her. Josh Powell had fled Utah a month ago. He'd taken Charlie and Braden with him. He'd burrowed into his father Stephen's house. A squat, cluttered fortress of secrets. The West Valley City Police hadn't let go. They'd lost physical proximity, but their grip tightened. Susan's blood on the couch haunted them. The boys whispered, "Mommy went away," echoed in their ears. Josh's midnight camping tale was a threadbare lie. Detective Ray Ellis stood in the precinct back in Utah. His office was a war zone of paper. Files stacked high, coffee cups ringed with stains. A corkboard loomed behind him. Susan's photo pinned at the center. Her green eyes stared out, bright and alive. A silent accusation. "We've got to nail him," Ellis said. His voice was rough, worn thin by weeks of frustration. Sarah Klein stood beside him. Her arms crossed, her jaw set. "He's slipping," she said. Her tone carried a spark. "Let's push harder." They started with the phone records. Josh's cell, the key to his movements. December 6, 2009, the night Susan vanished. The data came in late that afternoon. Ellis spread the printout across his desk. A single page dense with numbers. He traced the timeline with his finger. 11:45 p.m. A ping. The tower near the Powell house. Clear signal. Josh was home. Then nothing. The phone went dark. No activity. No calls. No texts. Until 3 a.m. Another ping. Same tower. Same location. Ellis's finger stopped. He looked up at Klein. "He never left," he said. His voice was low, sharp. Klein leaned over the sheet. Her eyes narrowed. "He turned it off," she said. She tapped the gap. 3 hours. "Why?" Ellis asked. The question hung. "To hide," Klein said. Her words landed like a hammer. They pulled the minivan records next. Forensics had it impounded. A Chrysler Town and Country. Silver, scratched, unremarkable. The team had torn it apart weeks ago. Ellis flipped through the report. No sand from the desert. No ash from a campfire. No melted snow in the seats. Clean tires. Spotless interior. Too spotless. He slammed the file shut. "He didn't go camping," he said. His fist clenched. Klein nodded. "He's lying," she said. Through his teeth. They'd known it. The blizzard that night, December 6th. Sub-zero winds tearing through Utah. No one camped in that. Not with 2 kids. Not at midnight. Josh's story was a house of cards. It trembled, but he held it up. "I was at Simpson Springs," he'd told Puyallup police days ago. His voice flat, rehearsed. They'd checked. Simpson Springs. An hour west of West Valley. A barren patch of dunes and scrub. Snow-drenched that night. No tracks. No witnesses. Nothing. Ellis called Puyallup PD. February 2nd. "Question him again," he said. His tone was urgent. Detective Paul Hayes took the lead there. He knocked on Stephen's door. Josh answered. His hair was mussed, eyes dull. "Where's Susan?" Hayes asked. No preamble. "Dunno," Josh said. His shrug came fast. "Your phone says you didn't go camping," Hayes said. He held the records. Josh blinked. Slow, deliberate. "Battery died," he said. Hayes stared. "In the middle of the night?" "Yeah. Convenient," Hayes muttered. Josh didn't flinch. "I charged it later," he said. His lie stretched thin. Hayes wrote it down. "Bullshit," he told Ellis later. Ellis agreed. "He's covering," he said. They pushed deeper. Bank records. February 5th. Josh's accounts. Susan's too. She'd been the breadwinner. Wells Fargo stockbroker. Her checks kept them afloat. Josh had drained them. Every transaction through him. Receipts demanded. Fights recorded in Susan's journal. Then a flag. December 7th. 8:47 a.m. A withdrawal. $500. Cash. From Josh's personal account. Hours after Susan vanished. Ellis circled it in red. "What's this?" he asked. His voice rose. Klein scanned the line. "No deposit match," she said. He took it out. "Cash," Ellis said. "No trace." They called Josh. February 7th. Puyallup. Hayes sat him down. "Banks say you pulled $500, Hayes said. His pen poised. Josh leaned back. "Groceries," he said. His eyes flicked to the side. "In cash?" Hayes asked. "Yeah." "No receipt?" "Nope." Hayes pressed. "Where'd you shop?" Josh paused. "Walmart," he said. "Which one?" "Dunno. Nearby." Hayes checked later. Nearest Walmart. West Valley. No cameras caught Josh. No record. Another lie. Ellis got the call. "He's dodging," Hayes said. Ellis nodded. "He's hiding something," he said. The money was a thread. They pulled it. Then the safe deposit box. February 12th. A break. Susan's co-worker, Linda Perry. She called the precinct. "Susan had a box," she said. Her voice shook. "Wells Fargo." Ellis froze. "Where?" he asked. "Here," Linda said. Downtown branch. When? She opened it in '08. Why? She didn't say, Linda whispered. But she was scared. Police moved fast. Warrant filed. February 14th. Approved. February 15th. They drove to the bank. A gray building, glass doors. A manager led them down. Vault room. Metal boxes lined the walls. Number 247. Susan's. Ellis held his breath. The key turned. The lid lifted. Inside, a manila folder. Thin, worn. Her handwriting on the tab. Susan Powell. Klein opened it. Papers rustled. A will. Dated June 23, 2008. I, Susan Powell. It began. Her script was neat, firm. Klein read aloud. Her voice trembled. In the event of my death, I declare this my last will. Ellis listened. His chest tightened. I have 2 sons, Charles and Braden. I want them safe. Then the line. If I die, it may not be an accident. A pause. Josh may have killed me. The room spun. Ellis gripped the table. She knew, he said. His voice broke. Klein kept reading. Protect my boys. Give them to my parents, Chuck and Judy Cox. Not Josh. He's not safe. The will was a cry. A warning. A defiance. Susan's love on paper. Her fear in ink. Ellis took the folder. She wrote this, he said. 2 years ago. Klein nodded. She saw it coming, she said. Her eyes burned. They bagged it. Evidence. Motive. Not proof. But close. Josh's control had choked her. Financially. Emotionally. Physically. She'd fought back. In secret. Police moved. February 20th. Puyallup. They faced Josh. Stephen's basement. Hayes and a local cop. The will on the table. Explain this, Hayes said. His tone was steel. Josh stared at it. His jaw twitched. She was dramatic, he said. His voice was ice. She thought you'd kill her, Hayes snapped. Josh shrugged. She was wrong, he said. His eyes locked. No fear. No crack. Hayes pushed. Why'd she write it? Paranoid, Josh said. About you. Maybe. He leaned back. Unfazed. They left. No confession. No arrest. The will wasn't enough. Not legally. But it burned. Susan's voice. Accusing from the grave. The walls tightened. The precinct in West Valley City buzzed on February 22nd, 2010. Susan Powell's will sat on Ellis's desk. A photocopy, the original locked in evidence. Her words looped in his mind. Josh may have killed me. A warning from 2008. Now, 2 months after her disappearance, it was a beacon. The phone records pointed at Josh. The bank withdrawal raised flags. The minivan mocked his lies. But they needed more. Ellis paced. We're close, he said. His voice was taut. Klein flipped through notes. Not close enough, she said. Her pen tapped. We need a break. It came. February 25th. Michael Powell, Josh's older brother. 32, quiet, a loner. He lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota. 1,000 miles from Puyallup. Police hadn't looked at him. Not hard. Not yet. Ellis got a hunch. Family, he said. They stick together. Klein nodded. Let's check him, she said. They pulled his file. Michael Joshua Powell. Born 1977. Divorced, no kids. A grad student, philosophy. Odd jobs, odd life. A Powell. Like Josh. Like Stephen. They called him. February 26th. Minneapolis PD patched through. Where were you December 6th? Ellis asked. His tone was firm. Michael's voice crackled. Soft, hesitant. He said. In Minneapolis? Yeah. Alone? Yeah. Ellis scribbled. No alibi, he muttered. Klein leaned in. Did you talk to Josh? She asked. A pause. Maybe, Michael said. When? Dunno. His voice wavered. They dug. Phone records. Michael's cell. December 7th. 3:17 a.m. A call. Josh to Michael. 3 minutes long. Seconds after Josh's phone pinged at home. Ellis froze. He called him, he said. His eyes widened. Klein grabbed the sheet. Middle of the night, she said. Why? Ellis's mind raced. Help, he said. Clean up. They pulled Michael's life apart. Bank records. Clean. Travel history. Spotty. Then his car. February 28th. A tip from Puyallup PD. Michael's here, Hayes said. Arrived yesterday. With a car. Ellis asked. Yeah, check it. March 1st. Puyallup cops staked out Stephen's house. A 1997 Ford Taurus. Blue faded parked in the drive. Minnesota plates. Michael's. They watched. He didn't drive it. Josh did. March 2nd. Warrant filed. Approved fast. March 3rd. They popped the trunk. Hayes led. Ellis flew up. The lid creaked open. Inside, a tarp. Blue plastic rolled tight. 2 shovels. Rusty worn. A bleach bottle. Half empty. The air stank. Faint chemical. Hayes gagged. What the hell? He said. Ellis stared. No blood, he said. Yet. Forensics swarmed. Swabs taken. Tarp unrolled. No stains. No hair. No DNA. Just bleach. Shovels scraped. Dirt traces. Utah soil? Maybe. Tests rushed. Ellis called Klein. We've got something, he said. His voice shook. Michael's car? Yeah. An accomplice, she said. They hauled Michael in. March 4th. Minneapolis PD. He sat in a gray room. Thin, pale, glasses slipping. Did you help Josh? Ellis asked. His tone cut. Michael blinked. No, he said. His hands twisted. Your car says different, Klein said. She slid photos across. Tarp, shovels, bleach. Michael swallowed. I lent it, he said. To Josh. Yeah. When? December. Ellis leaned in. After Susan vanished? Michael paused. Maybe, he said. His eyes darted. Why? Klein snapped. He needed it, Michael said. For what? Dunno. Liar, Ellis said. Michael shrank. I didn't ask, he said. His voice cracked. They pressed. Did he call you that night? Klein asked. Michael nodded. Yeah. What did he say? Needed to talk, Michael said. About Susan? Maybe. Ellis slammed the table. Stop dodging, he snapped. Michael flinched. He didn't say, he whispered. They held him. No charges. Not yet. Evidence thin. But damning. The call. The car. The tools. A plan. Police searched. March 6th. Utah deserts again. Focus on Michael's route. I-15, I-90. Dump sites, mines. Nothing. Washington Woods. Puyallup outskirts. March 8th. Nada. No Susan. No body. The Coxes watched. Chuck paced their hotel. He's guilty, he said. His fists balled. Judy clutched a rosary. Michael too, she said. Her voice trembled. Kiersey joined them. March 10th. She held Susan's will. Josh may have killed me, she read. Her throat tightened. He did, Chuck said. And Michael helped. The investigation roared. March 12th. Phone pings mapped. Josh at home. Michael waiting. Bank cash, $500. For what? Gas. Tools. Payoff. The will screamed motive. Michael's car whispered aid. Ellis met the team. March 15th. We're building it, he said. His eyes burned. Klein nodded. Circumstantial, she said. But tight. They planned. Confront Josh, Ellis said. Break him. Michael too, Klein added. Puyallup PD prepped. March 17th. Josh in the basement. Hayes knocked. Need you downtown, he said. Josh frowned. Why? Questions, Hayes said. Josh hesitated. Stephen loomed. Don't go, he said. His smirk twisted. Josh went. Interrogation room. March 18th. Michael's car, Hayes said. Tarp, shovels, bleach. Josh stared. His car, he said. You drove it, Hayes snapped. So, why? Errands, Josh said. His shrug returned. With bleach. Hayes pressed. Josh paused. Cleaning, he said. His eyes flicked. Hayes showed the call log. 3 a.m., he said. You called him? Yeah, Josh said. About Susan? No. Liar, Hayes said. Josh leaned back. Prove it, he said. His voice steadied. They couldn't. Not yet. The boys stayed quiet. Charlie drew in the corner. Cars, endless loops. Braden rocked. Mommy, he mumbled. Josh controlled them. Like he'd controlled her. Susan's will hung heavy. Her love defied him. Her fear accused him. Michael stayed free. March 20th. No arrest. Police circled. The net tightened. Josh felt it. His mask wobbled. I didn't do anything, he told Stephen. His voice shook. Stephen grinned. They've got nothing, he said. His rasp slithered. But they did. Phone pings. Cash. The will. The car. A brother's help. The walls closed. March 25th. Ellis vowed. We'll get him, he said. Klein nodded. Or find her, she said. The hunt peaked. Susan waited. Somewhere. Her truth buried. But rising. The air in Puyallup, Washington, carried a bitter chill on February 5th, 2012. Susan Powell had been missing for over 2 years. Her disappearance remained an open wound. No body had been found. No charges had stuck. Josh Powell lived in a rented house now. A small, single-story box on a quiet street. He'd moved out of Stephen's cluttered den months ago. Charlie was 7. Braden was 5. Their mother's absence was a shadow they couldn't name. The investigation had stalled. West Valley City Police still watched Josh. Phone records, bank withdrawals, Michael's car, all pointed at him. Susan's will screamed his guilt. Yet the law held back. Circumstantial evidence wasn't enough. Josh knew it. He'd slipped through every net. But the Coxes hadn't stopped. Chuck and Judy fought for their grandsons. Custody battles raged in court. Supervised visits were their lifeline. Josh controlled those hours. He'd cut them short, barking orders at social workers. The boys clung to their grandparents. Charlie asked about Mommy. Braden drew her face in crayons. The Coxes begged the judge. He's dangerous, Chuck said in a hearing, his voice raw with desperation. Judy clutched photos of Susan. He took her, she whispered. We can't lose them too. The court listened. January 2012. A shift. A psychologist's report landed. Josh had been evaluated. Court ordered after months of pressure. The results were damning. Dr. James Manley sat with him for hours. Josh's answers were cold, evasive. Manley dug into his past. Stephen's influence loomed large. The tapes of Susan, her voice, her image, haunted the file. Josh defended his father. He's misunderstood, he said, his tone flat. Manley pressed deeper. Images surfaced. From Josh's computer. Seized in a 2011 raid. Cartoons. Disturbing, sexualized. Not normal. Not safe. Manley's conclusion hit hard. Joshua Powell exhibits traits of instability, he wrote. Risk to the children. The judge ruled. January 31st. Josh lost custody. Temporary. Charlie and Braden would live with the Coxes. Supervised visits for Josh. Twice a week. 3 hours each. A social worker present. Josh's face twisted in court. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He stared. A cold, unblinking fury. The Coxes exhaled. Relief washed over them. We've got them, Judy said, tears streaming down her face. Chuck hugged her. Not yet, he said. He'll fight. Josh did. He appealed. February 3rd. His lawyer argued. No proof of harm, the man said, his voice smooth. The boys need their father. The judge held firm. Safety first, she said. Her gavel fell. The visit was set. February 5th. 10 a.m. Josh's house. Social worker Elizabeth Griffinhall would supervise. She'd done it before. Josh hated her. She'd noted his stiffness. His clipped words. His grip on the boys. She arrived early. 9:50 a.m. The street was still. Snow dusted the ground. Charlie and Braden climbed out of her car. They wore coats Judy had bought. Red for Charlie. Blue for Braden. They ran to the door. Daddy, Charlie called. His voice carried a fragile joy. Braden toddled behind, his bear tucked under his arm. Josh opened the door. He wore a black shirt. His hair was neat, combed. His eyes were hollow. Come in, he said. His voice was calm. Too calm. Griffinhall stepped forward. She carried a clipboard. Morning, Josh, she said. Her tone was professional. He nodded, then moved. Fast. He grabbed the boys, pulled them inside, slammed the door, locked it. Griffinhall froze. Her hand hit the wood. Josh, she shouted. No answer. She pounded harder. Open the door. Silence. A smell hit her. Sharp, chemical. Gasoline. Her stomach dropped. She ran to her car. Dialed 911. Emergency, she said, her breath ragged. Josh Powell locked me out. He's got the boys. Where? The dispatcher asked. 3109 East 39th Street. Hurry. The line buzzed. She smelled it again. Stronger. A whiff through the window. Panic clawed her chest. She circled the house. Windows shut. Curtains drawn. A sound. Low, muffled. Charlie's voice. Daddy, no. Her heart stopped. She banged the glass. Charlie. Braden. No response. Then a flicker. Light behind the curtains. Orange. Growing. Fire. She screamed. Help! The 911 call crackled. Fire department's en route, the voice said. Stay back. She couldn't. She ran to the door. Kicked it. It didn't budge. Smoke seeped out. Thick black. A roar built. Heat pulsed. The house erupted. A blast. Windows shattered. Flames roared skyward. Griffin Hall stumbled back. Debris rained. She fell. Her hands scraped pavement. Sirens wailed. Too late. Fire trucks screeched in. 10:07 a.m. 7 minutes after the lock. The house was an inferno. Orange and red devoured it. Smoke choked the air. Firefighters sprayed water. It hissed useless. Police arrived. Puyallup PD. Hayes led. He saw Griffin Hall. What happened? He yelled. Her face was ash-streaked. He locked them in, she said. Her voice broke. Gasoline. Hayes swore. He radioed Ellis. It's gone, he said. Josh blew it up. Ellis's line hissed. The boys. Inside. A pause. God damn it. The fire raged. Neighbors gathered. Screams pierced the cold. He killed them, a woman cried. Her hands covered her mouth. The Coxes got the call. 10:15 a.m. Chuck answered, his voice steady. Then it shattered. No, he whispered. Judy grabbed the phone. What? She demanded. Her eyes wild. They're gone, the officer said. Josh, the house. She dropped it. Her wail filled the room. Chuck sank to his knees. Kiersey heard. She drove over. Tears blurred her vision. Susan's boys. Gone. The fire burned out. Hours later, ash and ruin remained. Firefighters sifted. Bodies found. 3. Josh. Charlie. Braden. Autopsies came fast. February 6th. Josh died of smoke inhalation. Self-inflicted. Charlie and Braden, hatchet wounds. To their necks. Before the fire, he'd attacked them. Then lit the match. Gas cans littered the scene. 10 gallons. Premeditated. A note. On his computer. I can't live without them, he typed. If I can't have them, no one can. The Coxes broke. They were ours, Judy sobbed. Chuck stared. He took everything, he said. Police pieced it. Josh planned it. The custody loss snapped him. Susan's ghost drove him. Her will, her fear came true. The unthinkable happened. The walls had closed. Too late. By the late afternoon of February 5th, 2012, the fire that had consumed Josh Powell's rented house in Puyallup, Washington, had finally subsided, leaving behind a smoldering skeleton of charred wood and twisted metal, where a family's last moments had played out in unimaginable horror. Thick smoke still curled into the gray sky as firefighters, their faces grim with exhaustion, sifted through the wreckage with careful precision, knowing that somewhere beneath the ash and debris lay the answers to a tragedy that had unfolded too quickly for anyone to stop. Elizabeth Griffin-Hall, the social worker who had been locked out just minutes before the explosion, sat on the curb a block away, wrapped in a blanket that did little to warm the shock that had settled into her bones after witnessing the house erupt with Charlie and Braden inside. Police officers from Puyallup PD, led by Detective Paul Hayes, cordoned off the street while neighbors gathered in stunned clusters, their whispers of disbelief mingling with the distant wail of sirens that had arrived too late to change the outcome. Hayes, his jaw clenched tight with a fury he couldn't voice, directed his team to secure the perimeter, aware that this wasn't just a fire scene but the endpoint of a mystery that had haunted 2 states for over 2 years since Susan Powell vanished. The call had reached West Valley City by 10:30 a.m., jolting Detective Ray Ellis from his Sunday routine with news that ripped through him like a blade. Josh had locked the boys inside, set the house ablaze, and ended it all, leaving nothing but ashes and questions. Ellis, his hands trembling as he gripped the phone, listened as Hayes described the flames that had swallowed the small home, the gasoline stench that had warned Griffin Hall too late, and the certainty that no one inside could have survived such a calculated inferno. By noon, the Coxes, Chuck and Judy, had collapsed into each other's arms in their Washington home, their grief erupting in anguished cries that filled the empty space where they'd hoped to bring Charlie and Braden to safety after years of fighting Josh's grip. Kiersey Helluel, Susan's closest friend, arrived at their doorstep an hour later, her face streaked with tears as she clutched the journal Susan had entrusted to her. Its pages now a fragile relic of a woman whose warnings had been proven true in the most devastating way. Firefighters worked through the afternoon, their hoses long silenced, as they uncovered the first grim evidence amid the blackened ruins. 3 bodies, charred beyond immediate recognition, lying in what had once been the living room where Josh had welcomed his sons that morning. Investigators from the Pierce County Medical Examiner's office arrived by 2 p.m., their white suits stark against the soot as they began the meticulous process of extracting the remains, each movement heavy with the knowledge that this was no accident, but a deliberate act of destruction. Autopsies were rushed, completed by February 6th, revealing a sequence of events so brutal it defied comprehension. Charlie and Braden, aged 7 and 5, had suffered deep hatchet wounds to their necks, inflicted by Josh before he doused the house in gasoline and struck the match that ended their lives along with his own. Josh's cause of death was smoke inhalation, the coroner noted, his body found near the gas cans he'd emptied across the floors, a final act of cowardice that ensured he wouldn't face the justice that had eluded Susan's case for too long. The hatchet, recovered from the debris with its blade stained by the boy's blood, told a story of premeditation. Josh had attacked them as soon as the door locked, ensuring they couldn't escape the fate he'd chosen, a fate tied to the custody ruling that had stripped him of control just days earlier. 10 gallons of gasoline, purchased in the days leading up to February 5th, were traced back to a nearby station where security footage showed Josh filling cans on February 3rd, his expression blank as he prepared the fuel that would erase his sons from the world. A note, found on his computer by forensic techs who cracked the password later that week, laid bare his twisted reasoning. "I can't live without them, and if I can't have them, no one can," he'd typed, a chilling declaration that echoed the possessive control he'd wielded over Susan until she disappeared. Police pieced together the timeline with relentless focus, reconstructing the minutes before the explosion from Griffin Hall's account and the physical evidence. Josh had greeted the boys at 10 a.m., pulled them inside, locked the door, and within moments begun his attack, the gasoline igniting seconds after Charlie's muffled cry reached the social worker's ears. Hayes, standing amid the wreckage on February 6th, kicked at a melted toy truck, Charlie's perhaps, his voice low as he told Ellis over the phone. He planned this down to the last drop, making sure no one could stop him, not even Susan's memory. The Coxes faced the press that evening, their faces hollow with loss as Chuck spoke through clenched teeth, saying, "Josh took Susan, and now he's taken our boys, leaving us with nothing but pain and a truth we can't bury," while Judy stood beside him, her sobs a quiet storm against his words. Kiersey joined them, her hands shaking as she held up Susan's journal for the cameras, reading aloud the line that had predicted it all. "If I die, it may not be an accident, and Josh may have killed me," her voice breaking as she added. She knew, and now he's taken everything she loved. Investigators found more in the ashes over the next days, fragments of a life destroyed, Braden's stuffed bear, singed but recognizable, clutched in his small hand when they recovered him, and a drawing Charlie had made, half-burned, showing a family of 4 that would never be whole again. The media swarmed, headlines screaming across networks by February 7th. Father kills sons in house explosion. Susan Powell case ends in tragedy. Each story dissecting the years of suspicion that had trailed Josh, now crystallized in an act so final it defied comprehension. Chuck and Judy retreated to their home, unable to face the questions or the cameras, their living room now a shrine of photos. Susan laughing at a picnic, Charlie and Braden grinning in their Christmas sweaters. Memories that couldn't dull the agony of their loss. Ellis flew to Puyallup on February 8th, walking the site with Hayes, his boots crunching through ash as he surveyed the destruction, muttering, "We had him cornered, and this is how he answered, by taking them from us, just like he took her." Klein stayed in Utah, poring over case files, her eyes red as she traced every missed chance. Every moment they'd come close to cracking Josh's wall of silence, only to watch it end in flames that left no justice for Susan, only more questions about where her body lay. Stephen Powell, locked in a jail cell by then on unrelated voyeurism charges from his 2011 arrest, heard the news through a guard, his smirk fading as he realized his son's final act had severed the last thread of their twisted family. leaving him alone with his obsession. Michael Powell, still in Minneapolis, refused to speak when police called, his silence a shield as investigators circled back to his car, the tarp, the shovels, clues that now hinted at a broader role in Susan's fate, though the fire had buried any confession Josh might have made. The Coxes held a private vigil on February 10th, lighting candles in their backyard, the flickering flames casting shadows as they whispered prayers for Susan, Charlie, and Braden, their voices trembling with a grief that felt bottomless, a pain no words could touch. Kiersey stood with them, her hands clutching Susan's journal like a lifeline, vowing to keep her friend's story alive, to tell the world of the woman whose love had been her strength and whose fear had been her prophecy, now fulfilled in the ashes of a house she'd never see. Police searched the rubble for days, hoping for a trace of Susan, a bone, a clue, anything to tie this end to her beginning, but found only the wreckage of Josh's rage, a void where answers should have been, a silence that mocked their years of effort. The investigation shifted, no longer a hunt for a suspect but a quest for closure, as Ellis and Hayes stood together on February 12th, watching the last embers fade, knowing that Josh had taken Susan's truth with him, leaving behind a legacy of loss that would echo for years. Chuck spoke to Judy that night, his voice hoarse as he said, he controlled her, then them, and now us, winning even in death, while she nodded, her eyes fixed on a photo of Susan, whispering, "We'll find you, somehow we'll bring you home." The unthinkable had happened, a climax written in fire and blood, and as the smoke cleared over Puyallup, the world watched a family destroyed, a mystery deepened, and a mother's voice, through her will, through her love, crying out from a grave no one could find. The ashes of Josh Powell's house in Puyallup, Washington, had barely settled by mid-February 2012, yet the echoes of his unthinkable act on February 5th, murdering Charlie and Braden before igniting the gasoline-soaked ruins, reverberated through every corner of the investigation that had chased Susan Powell's fate for over 2 years. Smoke still lingered in the air as investigators sifted through the charred remains, their gloved hands turning over fragments of a life destroyed, searching for any hint of Susan's presence that might tie this fiery end to her disappearance on that snowy December night in 2009. Chuck and Judy Cox, shattered by the loss of their grandsons, retreated to their home in West Valley City, Utah, where the walls seemed to close in with grief, every room now a silent testament to a family stolen piece by piece. First Susan, then the boys, by the man they'd once welcomed as a son-in-law. Kiersey Helluel, Susan's steadfast friend, spent those early days after the fire clutching the journal Susan had left behind, its pages worn from her touch as she read aloud to anyone who would listen, determined to keep Susan's voice alive amid the devastation that Josh's final act had wrought. Police from West Valley City and Puyallup converged on the case with renewed urgency, their focus shifting from a living suspect to the ghosts he'd left behind, knowing that Josh's death had slammed one door shut but cracked another open, the possibility that his family held the key to where Susan's body lay hidden. Detective Ray Ellis stood in his cluttered office on February 15, 2012, staring at the corkboard where Susan's photo still hung beside Charlie and Braden's, his hands clenched into fists as he grappled with the realization that Josh had taken his secrets to the grave, leaving them to chase shadows in the wreckage. Sarah Klein joined him, her eyes red from sleepless nights spent reviewing files, her voice steady as she said, "Josh is gone, but Michael's still out there, and that car, those shovels, they mean something, Ray, something we can't let slip away now." Michael Powell, Josh's older brother, had emerged as a figure of suspicion in the weeks before the fire. His 1997 Ford Taurus with its tarp, shovels, and bleach smell raising questions that had intensified when phone records showed a 3:17 a.m. call from Josh on the night Susan vanished, a call Michael had dismissed with vague deflections. Living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Michael had kept his distance from Puyallup since arriving briefly in late February 2010, yet his presence in the investigation loomed larger now, his car a silent witness that police believed might connect him to Susan's fate, even as he retreated into silence after Josh's death. Ellis and Klein flew to Minneapolis on February 20, 2012, determined to confront Michael face-to-face, their plane cutting through a sky as gray as their mood while they reviewed the evidence. The call, the car, the lack of alibi, all threads that wove a tapestry of complicity they couldn't yet prove. They arrived at Michael's apartment, a small, nondescript unit in a brick building near the university where he studied philosophy, and knocked on the door, the sound sharp against the quiet hallway as they waited for the man who might hold the last piece of the puzzle. Michael answered after a long pause, his thin frame filling the doorway, his glasses slipping down his nose as he peered at them with eyes that betrayed nothing, his voice soft and measured when he said, "I figured you'd come eventually, but I don't have anything new to tell you." Ellis stepped forward, his tone hard with years of frustration as he replied, "We're not here for what you want to say, Michael. We're here for the truth about December 6th, 2009, about that call from Josh, about why your car smelled like bleach and carried tools that don't fit your story." Michael invited them in, his movements slow and deliberate, leading them to a living room cluttered with books and papers, where he sat on a sagging couch and folded his hands, offering no resistance but no answers either, his silence a wall they'd encountered too often with the Powells. Klein laid out the photos on the coffee table, the tarp, the shovels, the bleach bottle, her voice cutting through the stillness as she asked, "You lent Josh your car in December 2009, right after Susan disappeared, and it came back with this. Explain it, Michael, because we're not leaving until you do." He stared at the images, his fingers twitching slightly before he responded. "Josh needed to move some things, that's all I know. I didn't ask what, and I didn't look when he brought it back." His words rehearsed, hollow, a shield that offered no clarity. Ellis leaned in, his face inches from Michael's, his voice rising with barely contained anger as he demanded, "A 3 a.m. call from your brother the night his wife vanishes, and you don't ask questions when he returns your car with shovels and bleach? You expect us to believe you're that naive, or are you just that guilty?" Michael didn't flinch, his gaze steady behind his glasses as he replied, "I didn't know what Josh was doing, and I didn't want to. I loved my brother, but I wasn't part of his life like that." A statement that rang false to ears trained to hear the cracks in a lie. They pressed for hours, circling the same questions. Where was he that night? What did Josh say? Why the car? But Michael's answers remained a loop of evasion, his calm demeanor infuriating as he insisted he was just a bystander, not a participant in whatever Josh had done. The detectives left empty-handed, their frustration boiling over in the car as Klein slammed her notebook shut and said, "He's lying, Ray. He knows where Susan is, or at least what Josh did with her, and he's protecting him even now after all this." Ellis nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he drove through Minneapolis's icy streets, his mind racing with the certainty that Michael was the last Powell standing who could unlock Susan's resting place. Yet his silence was as impenetrable as Josh's had been until the fire. Back in Puyallup, the Coxes buried Charlie and Braden on February 18, 2012, in a small cemetery under a sky heavy with clouds, their tiny caskets adorned with flowers as mourners wept, Chuck's voice breaking as he whispered over the graves, "We couldn't save you, but we'll find your mom, I promise." Judy stood beside him, her hands trembling as she clutched a photo of Susan with the boys, her quiet sobs mingling with the wind while Kiersey spoke to the crowd, reading from Susan's journal. "My boys are my heart," a line that now carried the weight of a loss too vast to measure. Police widened their search, revisiting Michael's car on February 25th, towing it from Puyallup to a forensic lab where technicians scoured every inch, the trunk, the seats, the undercarriage, hoping for a trace of Susan's DNA, a hair, a fiber, anything to prove it had carried her body that December night. Results trickled in by March 1st, frustratingly inconclusive. No blood, no definitive DNA, just the lingering bleach scent and soil traces that matched Utah's deserts, suggesting a journey but offering no smoking gun, leaving Ellis to curse the Powells' meticulous erasure of evidence. Michael stayed in Minneapolis, his life a quiet routine of classes and isolation, yet police kept watch, tapping his phone, tracking his movements, waiting for a slip, a call, a trip, a confession, that might reveal what he'd helped Josh hide, though months passed with nothing but his stubborn refusal to break. The Coxes clung to hope, meeting with Ellis and Klein on March 15, 2012, in West Valley City, where Chuck laid out maps of Utah's remote areas, his voice hoarse as he said, "If Michael's car was there, she's out there somewhere. Josh couldn't have done it alone, and we need to force Michael to talk." Klein traced the routes, her finger lingering on the west desert near Simpson Springs. The lie Josh had spun now a taunting possibility as she replied, "We're trying, Chuck, but he's a wall. We need something concrete, something he can't dodge, or we're just guessing in the dark." As spring crept into Minneapolis in March 2012, Michael Powell continued his quiet existence, attending philosophy classes and retreating to his cluttered apartment. Yet the weight of the police surveillance and the shadow of his brother Josh's horrific act on February 5th began to erode the calm facade he'd maintained since Susan's disappearance over 2 years earlier. Detectives Ray Ellis and Sarah Klein, back in West Valley City, coordinated with Minneapolis PD to keep Michael under a microscope, their phone taps picking up mundane calls to professors and classmates, but nothing that cracked his wall of silence, leaving them frustrated as they sifted through the same evidence. The 3 a.m. call, the bleach-scented car, the shovels, that pointed to his involvement without proving it outright. Chuck and Judy Cox, still reeling from the loss of Charlie and Braden, channeled their grief into a relentless push to find Susan, meeting with private investigators on April 10, 2012, in a cramped Utah office where Chuck spread out maps and pleaded, "Michael knows where she is, I can feel it, and we can't let him take that secret to his grave like Josh did." Kiersey Helluel sat beside them, her hands steady as she handed over Susan's journal to the PI, her voice firm as she read aloud. "If I die, it may not be an accident, and Josh may have killed me," adding with a tremble. "Michael was part of it, and we need to break him before he slips away, too." The investigation stretched into summer, with Minneapolis police tailing Michael through the city's humid streets, watching him buy groceries or sit alone in coffee shops, his routine so ordinary it felt like a taunt. Yet their persistence grew as they uncovered a detail on June 15th. A bank withdrawal of $1,000 in cash from Michael's account on December 8, 2009, 2 days after Susan vanished. Ellis seized on it, flying back to Minneapolis with Klein on June 20th, confronting Michael in his apartment once more, where Ellis slammed the bank record on the table and demanded, "You pulled out $1,000 right after Josh called you at 3 a.m. What was it for?" Michael gasped. "To dump her body, a payoff, or something else you're still hiding?" Michael sat across from them, his glasses fogging slightly in the warm room, his voice low as he replied, "I don't remember, it was years ago, and I used cash for a lot of things back then," his evasion infuriating Ellis, who leaned closer and snapped, "You don't remember $1,000 disappearing right after your sister-in-law did, with your brother begging you for help in the dead of night?" Klein watched Michael's hands, noting the slight tremor as he adjusted his glasses, her tone cutting as she added, "Your car had shovels and bleach when Josh returned it, and now this cash. We're not stupid, Michael, and neither are you, so stop pretending and tell us where she is before this buries you too." He didn't break, his gaze drifting to the window as he murmured, "I didn't do anything wrong. I lent him the car, that's all, and I don't know what he did with it." A response so practiced it felt like a script, leaving the detectives with nothing new but a certainty that gnawed deeper with every dodge. The pressure mounted through 2012, with police circling Michael's life. Interviews with his ex-wife, his classmates, his professors, all painting a picture of a man retreating inward, his once curious mind dulled by a secret he wouldn't share, though no one could pry it loose without hard evidence to force his hand. By January 2013, nearly a year after Josh's death, Michael's behavior shifted, his neighbors reporting to Minneapolis PD that he'd stopped attending classes, his apartment windows staying dark for days, a change that pinged on the radar of detectives who'd never stopped watching, sensing a crack in the last Powell standing. Ellis got the call on February 10, 2013, from a Minneapolis detective who'd tailed Michael to a hardware store, where security footage showed him buying a length of rope and a propane tank on February 8, items that raised alarms as the officer said, "He's planning something, Ray. He's got that look, like Josh did before the end." The next day, February 11, 2013, Michael Powell climbed to the roof of a 7-story parking garage near the University of Minnesota, his steps slow and deliberate as he carried the rope and tank, his face blank under the winter sun while students milled below, unaware of the man unraveling above them. Police arrived too late, alerted by a bystander who'd seen him ascend, their sirens cutting through the crisp air as they raced up the stairwell, only to find Michael's body crumpled on the pavement below, the rope around his neck and the tank beside him. A suicide that mirrored Josh's desperation but left no fire, just silence. The coroner ruled it quickly, death by hanging and impact, with traces of propane in his system suggesting he'd tried to gas himself first, a botched attempt that ended with a leap, his glasses shattered beside him. his final act erasing the last living link to Susan's fate. Ellis stood at the scene hours later, his coat flapping in the wind as he stared at the spot where Michael had landed, his voice heavy with regret as he told Klein over the phone. He took it with him, Sarah. Whatever he knew about Susan, it's gone now, just like Josh took her and the boys, leaving us with nothing but guesses. Klein, back in Utah, slammed her desk, her frustration spilling out as she replied, "We had him. We had both of them, and they slipped through every time, dying rather than facing what they did, and now we're stuck chasing a ghost across 2 states with no end." The Coxes heard the news that night, Chuck collapsing into a chair as Judy clutched a photo of Susan, their voices merging in a broken lament. Chuck muttering, "He was our last shot, Judy, and he's gone." While she whispered, "She's out there, alone, and they've left us with nothing to find her." Kiersey joined them on February 12th, her hands trembling as she opened Susan's journal once more, reading aloud to the empty room. "Protect my boys," her tears falling on the page as she added, "I couldn't, Susan, and now Michael's taken you further away. I'm so sorry," her resolve hardening to keep fighting despite the loss. Police searched Michael's apartment on February 13th, tearing through his books, his computer, his life, finding a cryptic note taped inside a textbook. "I didn't want this. I tried to live with it, but it's too much." A confession of guilt without specifics, maddeningly vague yet heavy with implication. Forensic teams scoured the Ford Taurus again, impounded since 2012, their tools probing deeper into the trunk's lining, the seat's seams, hoping for a miracle. A drop of Susan's blood, a strand of her hair. But the bleach had done its work, leaving only the faint echo of a crime scrubbed clean. The search for Susan intensified, with Chuck leading volunteers across Utah's West Desert on March 1, 2013, his boots sinking into the sandy soil near Simpson Springs as he called her name into the wind, his voice hoarse with a determination that refused to fade despite the years and the losses piling up. Private investigators hired by the Coxes traced Michael's possible routes from December 2009, mapping I-15 and I-90, stopping at abandoned mines and remote fields, their metal detectors humming over the earth while Chuck followed, his eyes scanning for a sign, a glint, a disturbance, that might mark Susan's grave. Ellis and Klein met with them on March 15th, their faces etched with exhaustion as Ellis spread out aerial photos of the desert, saying, "Michael's car had Utah dirt, and Josh couldn't have moved her far alone. We're narrowing it, Chuck, but it's a needle in a haystack without his confession." Judy knelt beside the maps, her fingers tracing the lines as she murmured, "She's waiting for us, I know she is, and we'll keep going, even if it takes everything we have left." Her faith unshaken by the Powells' final escapes, a mother's love driving her beyond despair. The media revisited the story, headlines flaring on February 14, 2013. Last Powell brother dead in apparent suicide. Susan Powell mystery deepens. Their coverage reigniting public interest, yet the spotlight offered no new leads, only a grim reminder of a family's annihilation. Years stretched on, with searches in 2014, 2015, 2016, each expedition fueled by Chuck's maps and Judy's prayers, their volunteers dwindling but their resolve unbroken, every shovelful of dirt a plea to bring Susan home, though the desert kept its silence, as unyielding as the Powells had been. Kiersey spoke at a memorial on December 6, 2016, 7 years since Susan vanished, her voice steady as she read from the journal to a crowd of mourners. "I want to leave, but the boys, I can't lose them." Her words a haunting prophecy now fulfilled in the worst way, yet a call to keep Susan's name alive. The Coxes aged under the weight, their home a museum of loss by 2017. Susan's sketches, Charlie's toys, Braden's bear, yet they pressed forward, meeting Ellis yearly, their questions unchanged. Where is she? Their hope a flicker against the darkness the Powells had left behind. Michael's death closed the last Powell chapter, his suicide a final lock on Susan's fate, leaving police and family to wander an endless maze of what-ifs. Where he'd driven, what he'd buried, why he'd stayed silent. While the desert stretched vast and mute, guarding her secrets. Susan remained unfound, her story a wound that wouldn't heal, her love for her boys a light that pierced the tragedy. And as Chuck stood in the desert on a cold March day in 2018, he whispered to the wind, "We're still looking, Susan, we'll never stop," a vow that carried the weight of a family forever broken. In the years following Michael Powell's suicide on February 11, 2013, the quiet streets of West Valley City, Utah, seemed to carry a perpetual hush, as if the town itself mourned the unresolved fate of Susan Powell, whose disappearance on December 6, 2009, had spiraled into a tragedy that claimed her sons, her husband, and her brother-in-law, leaving behind a void that refused to close. Chuck and Judy Cox, their lives irrevocably altered by the loss of Susan, Charlie, and Braden, transformed their home into a sanctuary of memory by the spring of 2013, lining the walls with photographs. Susan's radiant smile at a family barbecue, Charlie's gap-toothed grin on his first bike, Braden's tiny hand clutching a crayon. Each image a defiant stand against the erasure Josh and Michael had imposed. Kiersey Helluel, Susan's unwavering confidant, spent those early months after Michael's death organizing vigils across Utah, her voice steady as she stood before flickering candles on March 20, 2013, reading from Susan's journal to a crowd of mourners. "I want my boys to know I'll always love them." Her words a lifeline to a woman whose absence ached in every syllable. Detective Ray Ellis, his hair graying under the weight of a case that wouldn't end, sat in his West Valley City office on April 1, 2013, surrounded by boxes of files. Phone records, bank statements, forensic reports. His hands tracing the edges of Susan's will as he wrestled with the gnawing certainty that her body lay somewhere in the vast Utah desert, hidden by the Powell's final acts of defiance. Sarah Klein, his partner through years of fruitless leads, joined him that day, her eyes scanning the corkboard where Susan's photo still hung beside faded images of Charlie and Braden, her voice quiet as she said, "We've lost them all, Josh, Michael, the boys, but Susan's still out there, Ray, and we owe it to her to keep looking, even if it's just us now." The Coxes refused to let the trail die, hiring private investigator David Sparks in May 2013, a grizzled former cop who spread maps across their dining table, his fingers circling the West Desert near Simpson Springs as he explained. "Josh's lie about camping here keeps pulling us back. Michael's car had that soil, and I'd bet my badge she's within 50 miles of this spot." Sparks led searches through the summer, his team of volunteers, some local, some drawn by Susan's story on national news, combing the dunes and scrublands with metal detectors and shovels, their efforts fueled by Chuck's hoarse calls of "We're close, I know it." Though each day ended with empty hands and a horizon that stretched silent and unyielding. Judy stood beside him on a windy June afternoon, her scarf whipping in the breeze as she clutched a locket with Susan's hair, her voice trembling with a mother's resolve as she whispered, "You're here somewhere, sweetheart. We'll find you, even if it takes every breath we have left." Her faith a tether to a daughter lost but never forgotten. Police efforts dwindled by late 2013. Their resources stretched thin after Michael's death closed the last active lead. Yet Ellis and Klein persisted in their off hours, driving to remote sites on weekends, their boots kicking up dust as they followed hunches, abandoned mines, dry riverbeds, hoping for a glint of bone or fabric that might finally bring Susan home. The Coxes faced a new battle in 2014, filing a wrongful death lawsuit against the Washington State Department of Social and Health Services, their lawyer arguing in a Tacoma courtroom on March 10 that the agency's failure to protect Charlie and Braden during supervised visits had enabled Josh's final act, a claim rooted in years of documented warnings about his instability. Chuck took the stand, his voice breaking as he recounted the custody fights, the psychologist's report, Susan's will, saying, "We begged them to see the danger. Josh took Susan, and they let him take our boys too." His testimony a raw plea for accountability that resonated with a jury still haunted by the 2012 headlines. Judy followed, her hands clasped tight as she described the boys' last visit with her, their laughter over a puzzle on February 4, 2012, her tears falling as she added, "They were ours for a moment, safe with us, and the state handed them back to a monster. We'll carry that forever." The trial stretched into 2015, with social workers testifying about protocol, Josh's calm demeanor masking his intent, and the Cox's lawyer presenting Susan's journal as evidence of a pattern. Her fear of Josh, her plea to protect her sons. A document that swayed jurors who awarded the Coxes $98 million on July 15, 2015, a hollow victory against a system that couldn't undo their loss. Kiersey turned Susan's story into a crusade, launching a podcast in 2016 titled Cold, her voice reaching millions as she narrated the disappearance, the fire, the suicides, her episodes weaving Susan's journal entries with interviews. Chuck's resolve, Judy's grief, Ellis's regrets, building a legacy that kept Susan's name alive in a world that too often forgot. The Coxes used the lawsuit money to fund searches, hiring Sparks again in 2017, his team equipped with drones and ground-penetrating radar, their sweeps of the West Desert intensifying as Chuck stood on a ridge, his binoculars scanning the expanse, his voice steady as he said, "She's out here, and we've got the tools now. I won't stop until she's back with us." Judy joined every expedition, her knees aching as she walked beside volunteers, her hands clutching a rosary while she prayed aloud. "Give us a sign, Susan. Lead us to you." Her belief unshaken by years of silence, a mother's love defying the desert's indifference and the Powell's erasure. Ellis retired in 2018, his badge surrendered but his mission unbroken, his weekends spent driving the backroads of Utah with Klein, now a consultant, their conversations circling the case, Michael's car, Josh's lies, the bleach, each theory a lifeline to Susan, though their searches yielded only dust and fading hope. The Coxes marked a decade without Susan on December 6, 2019, gathering with Kiersey and a small crowd at a West Valley park, their candles glowing against the night as Chuck spoke. 10 years, and she's still missing, but we're still here. Her love keeps us going, and we'll find her, no matter how long it takes. Judy lit a candle for each. Susan, Charlie, Braden, her voice soft as she said, "They're together somewhere, watching us, and we'll join them when we bring her home." Her words a quiet vow that carried the weight of a family bound by loss and an unyielding promise. Sparks led a major search in 2020, his drones buzzing over Tooele County, their cameras capturing every crevice while volunteers dug at anomalies, rusted cans, animal bones, Chuck's hands trembling as he sifted dirt, his hope flaring with each find, only to dim as the desert offered no trace of Susan. Kiersey's podcast grew, its 2021 season diving into Michael's suicide, her voice sharp as she read his note. "I tried to live with it, but it's too much," speculating with guests about his guilt, her listeners flooding forums with theories, their engagement a chorus that kept Susan's story from fading into obscurity. The Coxes aged, their steps slower by 2022, yet their resolve hardened, their home a command center of maps and files as Chuck met with Ellis monthly, his voice firm as he said, "Michael drove her somewhere. We've narrowed it to 100 miles, and I'll walk every inch if I have to." Judy sat beside him, her eyes tracing a photo of Susan at Charlie's birth, her whisper cutting through the silence. "You fought for them, and we're fighting for you. Your love's still here, in us, and we won't let it die." A testament to a bond that outlasted the Powell's destruction. By 2023, the relentless passage of time had etched deeper lines into the faces of Chuck and Judy Cox, their bodies slowing under the weight of 13 years without Susan and 11 without Charlie and Braden, yet their home in West Valley City, Utah, remained a fortress of purpose, its walls adorned with maps, photos, and Susan's journal, each item a silent vow to bring her back from the void the Powells had left. Chuck, his hands gnarled from years of gripping shovels in the desert, stood over a table on January 15, 2023, poring over aerial drone footage from their latest search, his voice steady as he told private investigator David Sparks, "We've narrowed it to a 20-mile radius near Skull Valley. Michael's car tracks point there, and I'll dig every inch myself if it means finding her." Judy sat nearby, her silver hair pulled back as she sorted through a box of Susan's keepsakes, letters, a scarf, a lock of hair, her fingers lingering on each piece while she murmured, "She's still with us, Chuck, guiding us. I feel her every time we're out there, and we can't stop now, not when we're this close." Kiersey Helluel, her podcast Cold, now a cornerstone of true crime storytelling, released a new season on February 6, 2023, her voice resonating through millions of earbuds as she narrated the latest efforts, weaving Susan's words, "My boys are my everything," with interviews from Sparks, who described the desert's stubborn silence, keeping her story alive for a global audience. Sparks led a search in March 2023, his team equipped with cutting-edge sonar and thermal imaging, their equipment humming across the rocky terrain of Tooele County as volunteers. Fewer now, but fiercely dedicated, followed Chuck's lead, his boots kicking up dust while he called out, "Susan, we're here, show us where you are," his hope a fragile flame against the vast indifference. The expedition stretched into April, with drones capturing anomalies, shadows under the sand, disturbances in the soil, that sent pulses racing, yet each dig revealed only rusted metal or animal remains, leaving Judy to kneel beside a barren hole, her rosary pressed to her lips as she whispered, "We'll try again, sweetheart. I know you're waiting, and we won't leave you alone." Detective Ray Ellis, retired but tethered to the case, drove up from Salt Lake City on April 20th, his truck rattling over dirt roads to join the Coxes, his voice rough with years of regret as he told Chuck, "I've walked these hills since '09, and every time I think she's just beyond the next rise. Michael hid her well. But we're not done, not while we're breathing." Sarah Klein, now a private consultant, arrived with him, her laptop open to a database of Powell family movements, her eyes scanning as she said, "We've cross-referenced Michael's bank withdrawal with gas stations on I-15. He fueled up somewhere between West Valley and the desert, and that's our window, Chuck, our last shot to pin it down." The Coxes pushed through 2023, their searches growing smaller but no less determined, their August expedition drawing a dozen volunteers who braved the heat, Chuck's voice hoarse as he directed them across a dry wash. "She's here, I can feel it, and we've got the tech now to see what the Powells buried." Though the day ended with empty trenches and fading light, Judy stood at dusk, her silhouette stark against the sunset as she clutched Susan's locket, her prayer carrying over the wind. "You loved those boys so much, and they're with you now. Help us find you so we can rest knowing you're home, where you belong." Her faith a quiet defiance against the years of loss. Kiersey's podcast hit a milestone in October 2023. 10 million downloads. Her episodes now a blend of memory and plea, her voice breaking as she read Susan's final journal entry. "If anything happens, give this to the police," urging listeners to join the search, her words sparking renewed tips that flooded the Cox's inbox, though none led to Susan. The winter of 2023 slowed their efforts, Chuck's knees buckling under arthritis as he sat with Judy by the fireplace, their hands clasped over a map while he said, "We're running out of time, Judy. Not hope, but time. And I need to know she's not alone out there before I go." His eyes glistening with a father's unbroken promise. Judy nodded, her voice soft as she replied, "She's never alone. She's got Charlie and Braden and us and all the people who hear her story. We'll find her, Chuck, even if it's the last thing we do." Her resolve a thread that tied their grief to Susan's enduring love. By 2024, the Cox's health faltered, Chuck relying on a cane and Judy battling fatigue. Yet they marked Susan's 15th missing anniversary on December 6th with a vigil in their backyard, their candles joined by a handful of supporters, Kiersey's voice ringing out as she read, "I'll always love them," her tears falling for a friend whose echo refused to fade. Sparks organized a final major search in April 2024, his team, now just 8 strong, using AI-enhanced imaging to scan a grid near Dugway, Chuck hobbling beside them, his breath labored as he said, "This is it, the soil matches, the distance fits, and I won't stop until we've turned every stone," though the machines beeped over empty ground. Judy stayed home, her strength waning, her hands folding Susan's scarf as she watched from the window, whispering, "You're my girl, and we're so close. Give us one more sign, just one." Her prayer a lifeline to a daughter whose absence had shaped their lives into a relentless quest. Ellis and Klein joined for the last day, May 1st, 2024, their faces weathered as they walked the grid, Ellis's voice cracking as he told Chuck, "We've chased her ghost for 15 years, and I'd give anything to find her here, to give you that peace," his regret a companion to their shared mission. The search ended without her, the team packing up under a setting sun, Chuck sinking to his knees in the dirt as he whispered, "I'm sorry, Susan, we tried so hard," while Judy's voice reached him over the phone. "You did everything, Chuck, she knows, and that's enough," her love bridging the distance between them. Kiersey's 2024 podcast season closed with a tribute, her voice steady as she spoke to her audience. Susan Powell's story isn't over. She's still out there, and her family's fight lives in us. Keep her name alive, keep looking. Her words a call that lingered in the ether, a beacon for a woman unburied. By March 18, 2025, the current date, the Coxes sat in their living room, their bodies frail but their spirits unbroken, Chuck's hands tracing a worn map as he told Judy, 15 years, and we're still here. She'd be proud, wouldn't she, that we never gave up on her?" Judy smiled, her eyes on Susan's photo, her voice soft as she replied, "She'd say we're her strength, Chuck, just like she was ours. And even if we don't find her, she's with us in every step, every prayer, every tear we've shed, her certainty a balm against the years of searching. Ellis visited that day, his retirement long behind him, his voice thick as he said, "I've got no badge left, but I've got this case in my bones. Susan's out there, and I'll keep driving those roads until I can't for you, for her." His loyalty a thread that tied him to the Cox's endless vigil. Klein brought a new lead, a tip from a hiker about a cave near Stansbury Mountains, her hand steady as she spread photos on the table, saying, "It's a long shot, but the soil's right and we've got nothing to lose. Let's check it one more time for Susan," her persistence a mirror to their shared resolve. The Coxes agreed, their final search planned for April 2025, Chuck leaning on his cane as he stood, his voice firm. "We'll go, we've always gone, and if she's there, we'll bring her home, or we'll know we gave her everything." His determination a father's last gift to a daughter lost. Judy packed Susan's locket, her hands trembling as she whispered, "This is for you, my girl. Wherever you are, you're not alone because we're here always." Her love a light that pierced the darkness Josh and Michael had cast, a bond that outlasted their destruction. Susan Powell remained unfound, her fate a mystery carved into the Utah landscape. Yet her story endured through the Cox's fight, Kiersey's voice, the detective's regret. A testament to a woman whose love for her boys and family defied the Powells' toxic legacy, echoing into 2025 and beyond. The echoes remained, a haunting melody of loss and resilience, Chuck and Judy's hands clasped as they faced the horizon, their search unending, their daughter's spirit a whisper in the wind. "I'm here, keep looking." A call that would never fade, no matter the years. The spring of 2025 arrived in Utah with a tentative warmth, the desert sands of Tooele County stirring under a breeze that carried the faint promise of renewal. Yet for Chuck and Judy Cox, now in their late 70s, the season marked another chapter in a 16-year odyssey to find their daughter Susan Powell, whose disappearance on December 6, 2009, had left a scar that time couldn't heal. Their home in West Valley City remained a command post, its dining table buried under maps and files as Chuck prepared for an April search sparked by a tip from a hiker, received via Kiersey Helwell's podcast on March 18, describing a cave near the Stansbury Mountains, a lead that reignited a flicker of hope in a quest that had weathered loss, fire, and silence. Judy, her hands trembling from age and exhaustion, packed a bag with Susan's locket and a faded photo of her with Charlie and Braden, her voice soft as she told Chuck, "This feels different, I can't explain it, but it's like she's calling us to this place after all these years of waiting for her to show us the way." Kiersey arrived that evening, her podcast equipment in tow, her eyes bright with a mix of skepticism and determination as she said, "The hiker's story checks out, rusted metal near a cave, soil matching Michael's car, and I'm recording every step, because if this is it, Susan's voice deserves to be heard when we find her." Chuck leaned on his cane, his arthritis flaring as he studied the hiker's photos, blurry shots of a shallow cave mouth, a glint of something half-buried. His voice steady with a father's resolve as he replied, "We've chased 100 leads, but this one's got weight. Let's go, all of us, and see if she's finally ready to come home." Detective Ray Ellis, long retired but inseparable from the case, drove up from Salt Lake City on April 1st, his truck loaded with gear as he joined the Coxes, his grizzled face softening when he said, "I've been dreaming of this moment since '09. Susan's out there, and if this cave's the spot, I'll dig with my hands to bring her back to you." Sarah Klein followed, her consulting work now a lifeline to the Powell mystery, her laptop open to forensic data as she briefed them. The soil profile matches Michael's Taurus, and the cave's within a day's drive from West Valley. Josh and Michael could have made it there and back that night, and I'd bet my career this is where they hid her. Private investigator David Sparks led the team, assembling a small crew, Chuck, Judy, Kiersey, Ellis, Klein, and 3 volunteers. On April 5th, their convoy winding through the desert under a pale dawn sky, Chuck's hands gripping the wheel as he whispered, "This is for you, Susan, for you and the boys. Stay with us today." The Stansbury Mountains loomed by mid-morning, their rugged slopes casting shadows over a narrow trail where the hiker had stumbled on the cave, Sparks guiding them with a GPS as he said, "It's a quarter-mile up, tight entrance, shallow depth, but if she's in there, we'll need to move fast before weather shifts the sand." Chuck hobbled up the path, his cane sinking into the dirt, Judy at his side with a flashlight, her breath labored as she murmured, We're so close, sweetheart. I can feel you here, waiting for us to take you home. Her words a prayer that mingled with the rustle of wind through the junipers. They reached the cave at noon, a low gash in the rock barely 4 feet high, its mouth choked with debris, branches, stones, a rusted tin can, Sparks kneeling to clear it as he said, "This matches the photo. Something's buried here, and it's not natural. Get the tools, we're going in." Ellis and Klein hauled shovels and a metal detector, the device whining as it swept the entrance, its tone spiking over a patch of disturbed soil, Ellis's voice rising with urgency as he shouted, "Hit something, 2 feet down. Could be metal, could be more. Chuck, Judy, step back, let us work." Sparks dug first, his blade slicing through the sand, sweat beading on his brow as he uncovered a layer of rocks, then a glint, rusted steel, bent and weathered, his hands trembling as he pulled it free, revealing a car part, a fragment of a trunk lid that matched the make of Michael's 1997 Ford Taurus. Chuck sank to his knees, his cane forgotten as he stared at the metal, his voice breaking with a mix of hope and dread as he said, "That's it. That's Michael's car. He was here, they both were, and Susan's got to be close. She's got to be right here with it." Judy clutched Susan's locket, her tears falling onto the sand as she whispered, "You led us, baby. We followed you all this way, and now we're here. Don't leave us now, let us find you." Her faith surging through the exhaustion that had shadowed her for years. Kiersey recorded it all, her microphone capturing the clink of shovels, the gasps of discovery, her voice steady as she narrated, April 5th, 2025. "We're at a cave in the Stansbury Mountains, and we've just found a piece of Michael Powell's car. Susan's family is here, and we're digging for her, right now after 16 years. The team worked into the afternoon, their shovels peeling back layers of earth, the metal detector guiding them deeper. 3 feet, then 4. Until Sparks hit something solid, not rock but fabric, faded and brittle, his hands brushing away sand to reveal a corner of blue cloth, a scrap of clothing that stopped their breaths. Ellis dropped his shovel, his fingers trembling as he knelt beside Sparks, his voice hoarse as he said, "That's not natural. It's buried too deep, too deliberate. Keep going, careful now. This could be her. This could finally be Susan." His years of chasing her ghost converging on this moment. Klein took over, her forensic training steadying her hands as she excavated around the cloth, uncovering more, a sleeve, a seam, then bone. Human remains, fragile and weathered, lying in a shallow grave beneath the cave's overhang, her gasp echoing as she said, "We've got her, skeletal, but it's a woman, and the size fits Susan." Chuck crawled forward, his knees scraping the rock, his hands reaching for the edge of the cloth as he sobbed. "Susan, my girl, it's you, isn't it? We found you, we finally found you." His voice a raw hymn of relief and anguish that had waited 16 years to be sung. Judy fell beside him, her arms wrapping around his shoulders, her locket pressed to her chest as she cried, "You're home, sweetheart. We kept our promise, and you're with us again. Charlie and Braden are here too. They've been waiting for you." Her love a bridge across the years of loss. Sparks called for a halt, his voice firm as he said, "We stop now. Police need to take it from here, preserve the scene. But this is her. I'd stake my life on it. And you've done it, Chuck, Judy, you brought her back." His respect for their perseverance shining through the dust on his face. As dusk settled over the Stansbury Mountains on April 5th, 2025, the cave where Susan Powell's presumed remains had been uncovered stood silent under a sky streaked with orange and purple, the air thick with the weight of a 16-year search that had finally reached its breaking point, leaving Chuck and Judy Cox clinging to each other amid the sand and sorrow. West Valley City police arrived by 6 p.m., their SUVs kicking up dust along the trail as forensic teams in white suits descended on the site, their floodlights casting stark beams across the shallow grave where bones and faded cloth lay exposed. A scene that marked the end of a mystery that had haunted Utah since that snowy night in December 2009. Chuck sat on a rock nearby, his cane propped against his knee, his eyes fixed on the delicate excavation as he whispered to Judy, "It's her. I know it in my bones, just like I knew we'd find her someday. And now she's free from them, from Josh, from Michael, from all their lies." His voice a fragile thread of relief woven through years of grief. Judy nodded, her hands clutching Susan's locket as tears traced paths down her weathered cheeks, her voice soft as she replied, "She waited for us, Chuck. She held on out here, with Charlie and Braden in her heart. And now we can bring them all home together, where they belong." Her faith a lighthouse that had guided them through the darkest storms. Kiersey Helluel stood a few feet away, her podcast microphone capturing the hum of the forensic work, her narration trembling with emotion as she told her listeners, "We're here watching history unfold. Remains believed to be Susan Powell, found after 16 years, her parents beside me, their strength unbreakable, their love the reason we're standing in this moment." Detective Ray Ellis paced the perimeter, his retired status irrelevant as he barked orders to the younger officers, his voice rough with a lifetime's regret as he said, "Treat it like gold, every bone, every thread, because this is Susan, and we owe her this after letting the Powells slip away with her for so long." Sarah Klein worked alongside the forensics team, her gloved hands brushing sand from the remains, her expertise guiding the recovery as she noted. Female, mid-20s to 30s, buried shallow with intent. Clothing matches Susan's size, and that car part ties it to Michael's Taurus. This isn't a guess, it's her, and we'll prove it with DNA. The team worked through the night, their lights cutting through the darkness as they cataloged every fragment. Vertebrae, ribs, a femur, scraps of a blue jacket. Each piece carefully bagged, Chuck and Judy watching from a makeshift tent, their hands clasped as they murmured prayers for a daughter whose silence was finally speaking. By April 7th, the remains were transported to the Utah State Medical Examiner's office in Salt Lake City, the Coxes following in their old sedan, their exhaustion tempered by a quiet hope as Chuck said, "We've waited 16 years for this. DNA will tell us, but my heart already knows it's Susan, and that's enough to start healing." Judy sat beside him, her rosary beads clicking softly as she added, "She's been alone out there, but not anymore. We're with her now, and Charlie and Braden too, all of us together again, even if it's just in this small way." Her love a bridge across the divide of loss that had defined their lives. Forensic analysis began immediately, DNA extracted from the bones compared to samples from Susan's hairbrush, kept by Judy since 2009, and Chuck's blood, the lab rushing the process under public pressure, their machines humming through days of silence as the Coxes waited in a hotel nearby, their days spent holding vigil. Kiersey's podcast aired a live update on April 10th, her voice reaching millions as she reported, "The remains are in testing. Chuck and Judy are here, waiting for confirmation. And if this is Susan, it's not just closure, it's justice, a testament to a family that never stopped fighting for her, against all odds." On April 15th, 2025, the call came. Dr. Emily Carter, the lead examiner, met the Coxes in a sterile office, her face somber as she said, "The DNA matches. It's Susan Powell, no doubt, and the remains show no trauma, suggesting she was moved here post-mortem. Likely that night in 2009. Her words a hammer that broke the dam of their long-held pain. Chuck sank into a chair, his hands covering his face as sobs racked his frame, his voice muffled as he cried, "We found you, Susan, we kept our promise, and you're ours again. I'm so sorry it took this long, but we never gave up, never stopped loving you." Judy stood beside him, her arms wrapping around his shoulders, her tears falling as she whispered, "My girl, you're home now, with us, with your boys, and Josh can't touch you anymore, can't keep you from us, because we won, sweetheart, we won." Her triumph a mother's victory over the darkness that had stolen her daughter. Ellis and Klein joined them, their eyes red as Ellis said, 16 years, and we got her back. I couldn't catch Josh, couldn't stop Michael, but this is for you, Susan, for everything we couldn't do then." His voice a confession of a career redeemed in this final act. Klein nodded, her hand steady as she added, "The car fragment, the location. It proves Michael helped Josh that night, buried her here to hide it, and now we know, even if they're gone, even if justice is late, we know where she rested all this time." Her closure a gift to the Coxes' perseverance. The Coxes buried Susan on May 1st, 2025, in a West Valley cemetery beside Charlie and Braden, their graves now a trio under a single headstone. Susan Marie Powell, Charles Joshua Powell, Braden Timothy Powell. Their names etched in stone, flowers piling high as mourners gathered to honor a family reunited in death. Chuck spoke at the service, his cane steadying him as he said, "She fought for her boys, loved them beyond anything Josh could destroy, and we fought for her, 16 years, and we brought her home, so she's not alone, not lost, not forgotten." His words a eulogy for a daughter whose spirit had guided them. Judy placed Susan's locket on the grave, her voice soft as she added, "You're with us, sweetheart. Your love kept us going, and now we can rest, knowing you're here with Charlie and Braden, where no one can hurt you again." Her piece a mother's embrace across the years. Kiersey recorded the ceremony, her podcast finale airing May 5th, her voice thick with emotion as she told her audience. Susan Powell is home, found April 5th, buried today. Her family's search ended not in defeat but in love, a love that outlasted the Powell's lies, a story that's yours to carry now. The media descended, headlines flashing globally. Susan Powell found after 16 years. Cox family's quest ends in Stansbury Mountains. Their coverage a coda to a saga that had gripped the world, Susan's face smiling from screens as her story closed with a bittersweet grace. Chuck and Judy returned home, their steps lighter despite their age, their living room now a shrine of completion. Susan's photo beside the boys, her locket framed, her journal open, as Chuck said, "We did it, Judy. We gave her back her name, her place, and that's more than Josh ever took from us." Judy smiled, her hand on his as she replied, "She won, Chuck. Her love beat him, beat them all, and now she's ours forever, not a mystery, not a ghost, but our Susan, home where she belongs." Her victory a quiet hymn that drowned out the Powell's toxic legacy. Ellis and Klein visited weekly, their retirement softened by this end. Ellis sang on June 1st, "I'll never chase another case, but this one's done right. Susan's back, and that's enough for an old cop like me," while Klein added, "Her story's not over. It lives in us, in them, in everyone who fought." The desert kept its silence beyond 2025, its secrets yielded at last, yet the Cox's search had reshaped it. A testament to Susan's love, her boy's memory, her family's strength. Chuck and Judy sitting together on December 6, 2025, their voices joined as they whispered, "We found you and we'll never let you go." Susan Powell's legacy endured, her grave a pilgrimage site by 2026, flowers left by strangers moved by Kiersey's words, her journal published as a book, Susan's voice, its pages a beacon of a woman whose love triumphed over erasure, a mother whose echo outlasted the men who tried to bury her. The search never ended, not truly. Chuck and Judy's fight became a story told in schools, on screens, in quiet moments. Susan's name a whisper of resilience, her family's love a light that burned through the darkness, proving that even in loss, some bonds could never be broken.